Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our third annual Class of 2021 Student Loan Playbook webinar. We are so happy to have you here. I'm going to go through a few housekeeping things, and then I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Tony Bartels, your presenter. So first and foremost, we are going to put some information into the chat window. If you have any technical issues, go ahead and put that into the chat window. But if you have any questions, which we really encourage, go ahead and put those into the Q&A window at the bottom of the screen. You'll notice that there's a Q&A section and it's right next to the raise hand. Go ahead and put all your questions in there. You have the option to ask questions anonymously, or you are able to put your name, and we will be going throughout the presentation and answering those in the background. I am here as well as some of our Rising Leader Committee members, recent grads, and some less recent grads. And so we're here to answer your questions throughout. We really encourage you to ask questions. You have this phenomenal resource in Dr. Tony Bartels here tonight, and it really is your opportunity to ask away. So we assure you there's no stupid questions, there's no silly questions, just go ahead and ask. And we will be going through those throughout the presentation, answering some in the background, and then some throughout the presentation. I will be asking Tony live for answers. And if we don't get through those at the end of the presentation, we will make sure that we answer all the relevant questions as well. So once again, any questions, go ahead and put those in the Q&A window. And if you have any technical issues or you want to share where you geographically are or where you might be going, go ahead and put that in the chat window. We thank you so much for being here. And Dr. Tony Bartels is going to share a lot of really helpful information tonight. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tony.
Thank you, Jordan. Yeah, and I really, this is kind of the nuts and bolts, right? So I know that we spend a lot of time, and some of you may have even seen a climbing Mount Debt session during your tenure at veterinary school, but now we want to talk more specifically about how do you get this repayment process started, and that's really what this is about, right? So a lot of you are kind of in between, graduation and starting either your internship or your first job, and ideally we want to help you get your loans taken care of as soon as possible here, so you don't have to worry about them, and getting your loan repayment plan started sooner rather than later can really help you avoid mistakes, right? So this is the time of year where I also start to see some of the mistakes that are made by the prior graduating class, right? So these are the folks that graduated in 2020 that are now, well, I didn't consolidate after I graduated, I lost track of time or whatever the case might be, and now their loans are a little bit of disarray, right? So we're trying to help you learn from those experiences as well, so you can not make some of the same mistakes that many of us have made before. So we're going to cover a lot of the details behind how do you actually walk through the application and consolidation process, which the title slides got on here. I'm going to encourage you all to start that consolidation as soon as you can, and you can even do it as soon as after the webinar or tomorrow or whenever you're next connected to the internet. We have some recent grads and members of the Rising Leader Committee within the VIN Foundation to help answer some of the questions too, and even provide some experience on how they got started in their student loan repayment. But the graduating class of 2020 and 2021, you guys are kindred spirits here, right? And both of you have graduated now into this pandemic situation that we're all living through, but it has also had some really unique impacts on your student loans directly, right? So to me, we're going to talk a lot about that too, but tonight, but the pandemic has had, from a student loan standpoint, has had the most direct impacts to your graduating class and the class behind you. So there's certain things that we want to make sure you're aware of and address those and make sure that we answer any questions that are directly associated with that, because I'm still seeing some of that weirdness play out from the 2020 graduating class that I'm going to share with you, and then hopefully not see that same thing happen to your graduating class in certain instances. But we're gonna talk more about that as we get into here. This is all put on by VIN Foundation. We couldn't do it without the help of VIN directly, but VIN Foundation is a nonprofit arm of VIN. All of the student debt resources that are available to you are available for free. Anybody can use them, actually, and I see lots of people using them, but they're designed specifically for veterinarians and veterinary students. So any, if you find this useful, we're not asking for a lot, but any contribution helps us to maintain and move these resources forward. Spend a lot of time behind the scenes with the development folks on VIN, and even with help from Jordan, trying to make all of these tools as veterinary friendly as possible. So certainly, I know you guys are just recently graduated, and then you're not swimming in cash. We're not asking for a lot, but anything that you can contribute, or if you feel that this was particularly helpful, after the webinar, maybe you a suggested donation of $10 would be great. I do want to call out the VIN Foundation Rising Leaders Committee. This is a new group that we formed with the mostly 2020, but also now a 2021 graduate on that Rising Leaders Committee. And they have started a Facebook group called DVM Now What, right? So that would be something I would encourage you all to join. So it's kind of your peers, sharing all of those experiences of, hey, I've got this degree, what do I do now, right? And so special thank you to Dr. Matt Holland, who's an employee of VIN. He's also an advisor of that committee. But Dr. Mears, Dr. Lanskov, did I get that right, Shiloh?
Lanskov.
Yeah,
We tried.
So close. And then now newly minted Dr. Emily Farmer from Kansas State. So they're here behind the scenes to help answer some of these questions and provide some context too for those of you that are entering repayment, because they are certainly closer to the entering repayment phase than I am. So they can help you more with those questions. And then, do you guys have anything that you want to add while I'm on this particular slide? Nothing. Silence. All right. Well, they are here. They are, they're behind on my guns. I would be surprised if Rebecca didn't have something to say.
Yeah, I can chime in for a second if you'd like.
Sure,
I think was that awkward, like who's gonna go first?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Rebecca Mears. I graduated in 2020 from University of Georgia. Attended this webinar last year, took a lot really kind of away from it. And so I was actually true on nerd. I watched the first one before I watched the first one before I watched this one, because I wanted to make sure I got all of the information that I could out of it. And I am a repeat exposure learner. So I, like I said, really wanted to tackle my loans as best as I could coming out of vet school. And so definitely recommend, take notes, kind of pay attention, see what's going on. The recording will be sent to everybody that registered for this event afterwards. So you can, if you have questions that you need to follow up back on and see anything, absolutely take advantage of that. And so I ended up in a revised pay as you earn repayment plan, consolidated my loans after I graduated. And so I've been doing that over the last year. Like Dr. Bartels mentioned, the kind of COVID Relief Act and whatnot has really sort of impacted how my loans are working this year, which has been really, kind of overall beneficial, the 0% interest. And obviously I was already on a no repayment required plan. So I really kind of took away a lot of great knowledge from this event last year, and highly recommend also utilizing the VIN message boards in order to get a post on there about your specific situation. You can post that anonymously. I have one on there. And so it's been a really great resource for me to talk with Dr. Bartels, and as I have other questions come up, and sort of get that guru type advice about how I should be handling everything best. So definitely really glad to have everybody here joining us this evening, and I hope you get a lot of takeaways from it.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that, Rebecca. Yeah, and we'll talk more about the student debt message board folder and how you can get that personalized assistance a little bit later as well. All right. Anybody else want to jump in, or I will just roll into the meat and potatoes here, or the faux meat and potatoes, depending on your dietary preferences. To shout at Matt. All right. So this is what we're going to cover tonight. First, now that you guys are done with school and done borrowing, you can look at your student loans and know that that's the balance you're going to be dealing with, right? So we're going to have you take your head out of the sand and look at that. And many of you have already filled out that student debt and income signament form, which is extremely helpful. That is really, those are going to be the steps that are going to be required to get you started in repayment, right? So knowing that the loan types that you have will also help you pick a repayment plan based on those loan types. Your repayment options are also going to be a function of those loan types that you have and that you find. I've got a breakdown I'll share with you that you provided in terms of the various loan types that you're all dealing with. From that information, we can do physical exam and diagnostics on your student loans, right? So we're gonna approach this clinically, just like you're going to start treating your patients clinically. We want to know what we're dealing with before we start generating prescriptions and treatment plans, right? So that initial analysis of that information is going to really help us dive in, do that physical exam and diagnostics, and then come up with that overall treatment plan for our student loans. There are going to be there are going to be side effects with whatever repayment strategy you choose. So we just want to be aware of them, right? There is no perfect way to do this. There's no right or wrong way to do this, right? There's just pros and cons. And whether you take an income-driven repayment approach like Dr. Mears was talking about and like my wife and I are using, or if you try to pay your loans back as fast as possible, all of those are going to come with side effects, right? So either, one is either going to require a significant amount of resources to pay those loans back faster, or if you're going to take more of an income-driven approach, that may end up in forgiveness, which is going to be something you're going to have to watch and plan for potentially, right? So there's going to be side effects regardless of the repayment strategy that you take here. But if we can identify them, call them out, and then come up with some treatment protocols for those side effects, they're less scary and a little bit easier to deal with. We'll finish up here with thinking beyond student debt. So all of this stuff is really geared towards helping you take your student loans and move them a little bit to the side so you can start all of the other things that I categorize under financial wellness that will ultimately help you be better prepared financially in the long run than just dealing with your student loans, right? Your student loans are important and you should deal with them and take care of them appropriately, but they're not the only part of your financial plan, right? You have to figure out a way to create a robust financial plan, even with your student loans, no matter how much student debt you have, right? And the range that people provided me tonight, for those of you that filled out your signament form, was less than $10,000 of student debt to more than $400,000 of student debt, right? So that's quite a variance, and handling those varying amounts of student debt are going to look very different depending on your circumstances. We've alluded to the fact that you're also one of the unique classes that are graduating into this pandemic, and COVID-19 has had a direct impact to your student loans as well. So since March 13th of 2020, no interest has been accruing. That has been a huge, huge benefit for your graduating class specifically. So you've had interest turned off for more than a year, right? And it got turned off at a point where a lot of you had some of the, highest balances that you were going to have at that point in your veterinary school career, right? So turning that interest off at that point has the biggest impact because it reduces the amount of interest that would normally accrue. Now, one of the not so good side effects of that is I find that most people have forgotten that interest actually does accrue on their student loans, and they have no idea what those interest rates are. And I see that in the submissions for, what's your interest rate, right? So, I see people that put the obvious 0%, then I have other people that are telling me that their student loans are at 10%, right? Which might be true if you have a private loan, but it's not true with your federal student loans, right? So, we're going to have to spend a little bit of time re-educating and being aware of what our student loan interest rates are. So when they do turn them on, probably October 1st of this fall, we're prepared for what that's going to look like. All right, so why am I so passionate about this? Because I'm dealing with it myself, right? So I graduated from Colorado State in 2012 from the combined MBA DVM program. I thought I was doing all of the things I was supposed to do to keep my student loans as low as possible. I moved to Colorado, I established residency, and I still ended up borrowing more than I was expecting. I also met my now wife in veterinary school at Colorado State, as we were talking about earlier. We got married in Estes Park in Colorado. but she brought even more debt to the table than I had, right? So she was a non-resident at Colorado State, and she graduated in 2009 and went on to specialize in small animal internal medicine, and is now a specialist here practicing in Denver, and we get to do some practice together in Gunnison County, which is kind of in south central Colorado, in a mountain town. But those are things that I really didn't see coming, but I ultimately had to deal with. And we learned a lot, right? It's particularly about what to do and what not to do specifically with student loans, particularly in the internship residency case, which I saw a lot of questions come in about through the registration and the signalment form. So we'll talk about that stuff as well. But combined, we have student debt in excess of $400,000. And we manage that currently with an income-driven repayment plan. But if you do nothing, right, and this is where your class is a little bit different than the class of 2020. If you do nothing between now and when your grace period ends, right? So even though the pandemic is in effect and there's no interest and there's no payment, if that pandemic forbearance period that your student loans are in now ends as scheduled on October 1st, let's say you graduated in May, you have another month or so of a grace period. If you do nothing with your loans until that point, they're going to put you into the standard 10-year plan. That's the default repayment plan that all of your federal student loans will go into, right? And that will happen for you, presuming that this pandemic forbearance ends as scheduled on October 1st, probably sometime around November, December, based on when you graduated. Right now, the standard 10-year plan is calculated based on the amount that you borrowed, plus your interest rates on all of those loans, right? And they calculate what the monthly payment needs to be to pay the balance to zero in 10 years, right? Or 120 monthly payments. So at a $400,000 balance, using our combined one as an example, that will generate a monthly payment, a minimum monthly payment of $4,500 per month, right? Which is more than most of you are going to want to pay, right? So especially as you're just getting started. For us, we weren't even earning that per month, right? So we couldn't do that even if we wanted to. So, that's where some of these other options come in handy, right? And there's a laundry list of repayment options that are available through your federal student loans or your direct loans anyway. One of them is an income-based repayment plan. That was the first one that we started out with. And as the name implies, the payment is a function of your income. Since then, we've switched to a different plan called Revised Pay As You Earn, right? It's also a type of payment that is based on our income. But it got us down to a lower monthly payment. Now that has some side effects, right? So paying $930 per month on $400,000 of student loans means we're not covering the interest, right? So what does that look like, right? You can actually have a loan balance that grows even though you're making payments towards your student loans, right? So that's one of the side effects or it can be one of the side effects commonly with income-driven payment. So if your loan balance is growing, right, the way the income-driven plans work is that they allow you to make payments for a specified period of time based on the plan that you choose. Now, the original version of IVR and the version of Repay that we're currently using allows you to make payments towards your loans for 25 years maximum, right? And if you still have a balance remaining at that maximum repayment period, the 25 years, whatever is remaining gets forgiven, right? But that forgiveness is treated as taxable income, probably. Right? We'll talk about that too, because there's been some legislative changes recently that have exempted student loan forgiveness from taxability, but only in the short term here. So what does that mean? It means that when we are in repayment and we're not in a pandemic forbearance, we make the minimum our income requires. We're anticipating hitting forgiveness, and we're also anticipating having to pay a tax on that forgiveness. So we're also planning, actively setting money aside, invested in a combination of investments that is generating a return on that investment. And we're about 70% to our projected forgiveness target with 16 years to go, right? And what that means is essentially we're ahead of schedule, right? So if Repay has a maximum repayment period, we're not quite halfway through Repay, but we're 70% of the way towards our projected forgiveness target, right? And that allows us to keep our loans in good standing. It allows us to cover that tax if and when we have to pay for it. And it also allows us to have a financial plan that involves something other than just paying back our student loans. All right, so for those of us that are in repayment, And now, you guys are just graduated, so you're not quite in repayment yet. But the pandemic forbearance, for those of us who are in repayment, also shut off the monthly payments that were due, and it counted the time that we've been in the forbearance period towards forgiveness, right? So we're not going to be in repayment any longer than we were supposed to be before, and we got the added benefit of no interest accrual and no payment being due, right? Which has actually been a huge financial bonus, right? I mean, we have probably saved, north of $20,000-$30,000 over the last 15 months in payments that we would have otherwise had to make towards our student loans because of the pandemic forbearance. So some of you, and I think I see this I see this commonly with the student debt and income signalment form, is you guys get to the question where it asks you to upload your student aid data file, and either, you don't have the time, or you can't, you don't know how to do it, or whatever the case is. We're going to make sure that everybody can find that student aid data file, because this is one of the most important steps that comes with doing the physical exam of your student loans, right? It's one thing to know what the numbers are, but you really need to know what types of loans we're dealing with, and that's where that student aid data file is going to come in really handy. All right, so that's going to lead us over to the physical exam. All right, so what are we going to find in that studentaid.gov portal? For the most part, we're going to find these direct unsubsidized, direct grad plus loans, direct subsidized if you borrowed for undergrad. If you started your higher education career before 2010, July 2010, you may have some federal family education loans, right? This is the older loan program that predated the direct loan program. You want to know if you still have some of these older school loans. Perkins loans will also be in there, but that program has since been discontinued in 2018. And then some schools, you're able to borrow health profession student loans or loans for disadvantaged students. A few of you reported having some of those. These are not going to be found in that student aid system, but they are a type of federal loan, but they're administered at the school level. All right, so we're going to keep track of those separately, and I'll show you how you can do that. Now, private loans, you may even have some of those. That's going to be anything that doesn't fall into this category, and usually those have a bank name associated with it, right? So it's either a Wells Fargo or Discover, or the name of a foundation, or it might even be your school name if you borrowed a private loan directly from a school. Based on what you guys told me, this is a pretty typical breakdown, right? So, better than 90% of the student debt that most graduating veterinarians have falls into that federal category. There's usually something around 10 to 15% of you that have health profession student loans, a smaller percentage with loans for disadvantaged students. Parent plus loans, now these are a little bit different. We're going to have to talk about these, or if you have any questions about these, it's a great time to ask them. But the parent plus loans, unless you're a parent yourself, right? So unless you're actually borrowing loans for your kids' higher education, then these parent plus loans are actually in your parents' name, right? Even if they took those out for you, those are going to be in your parents' name, which means your parents can actually log in to the studentaid.gov system, and I would encourage them to do so, and they'll have their own student aid data file, right? And there's actually no way for you to get those parent plus loans that are in your parents' name, even though they borrowed them for you. There's no way for you to get them into your name, or at least not easily, right? And certainly not within the federal student loan system. So that usually, causes confusion and comes up. But you can certainly, I find a lot of new grads have some great intentions of wanting to pay those back on their parents' behalf. But the first thing you need to do is take care of your loans, and then we can talk a little bit more about how you can also try to take care of your parents' loans on top of that. Private student loans, now these are going to require you to know the terms of those loans, right? The federal student loans are all very public, and they're all very consistent. All the terms are the same, right? But private loans are all different, right? It depends on the terms that you agreed to when you took that private loan out. So I encourage you to find that promissory note, the master promissory note that comes with all of those loans, so you know specifically how repayment is structured, what the interest rates are, how the payments change, if you have some deferment provisions. All of that stuff should be laid out in the promissory note that you signed for those private student loans. Family loans, I do find those to, occasionally as well. So if you have an agreement with your family that paid for your education and now you're going to pay it back, I treat these a lot like private loans, right? It can be a tough conversation, but you really want to sit down with your family and establish some terms that you both agree to. right? Don't just, send them some money when you can, right? Sit down and say, hey, what's a reasonable repayment time frame and what's a reasonable monthly payment that I can afford to try to pay that back, right? This is where I see things kind of go south quickly, is when, the parents are thinking you're going to pay it back sooner than you actually can, and that can cause some drama within the family. So the others typically, right? So the Grad Plus loans, I find this quite commonly. A lot of people think those Grad Plus loans are different, right? But they are in this same category, right? They're a direct loan, right? Or they might be a federal family education loan if you've been in school for a while, but they are a type of federal loan, right? Even though you had to make a separate application for them through your FAFSA, they still fall under this universe that is represented by this purple bar. Some of these other ones, I don't really know anything about. The Ontario ones, I'm guessing these are, your Canadian citizens are eligible for some Canadian loans. Those are also, I would treat those similar to the private loans, or if you know specifically what your Canadian repayment terms are. I know some of the different provinces have similar income-driven repayment options, but that's not something that I know very much about at all. All right, so what you're mostly going to find are those direct loans in your student aid data file. Those health profession student loans, which a good chunk of you have, and loans for disadvantaged students are not going to be found in there, but they are a type of federal student loan. So all of that is eligible or available through that studentaid.gov website. When it comes to the private loans, this is the information I'm really looking for. What is the interest rate? Is it a fixed interest rate, variable interest rate? What is the minimum monthly payment? When does it start, right? How long do they expect me to be in repayment? If I'm heading into an internship, do they allow me to defer that loan? Is there a cosigner, right? You want to make sure that, you know the answer to all of those questions. And if not, then reach out to that private lender and see if they can answer those questions for you. If you lose track of something, check your credit report, right? This is a great habit to get into. You can get a free credit report from the 3 major reporting entities for free once per year. This is a great time to do that. I usually do it right around tax filing time, just to make sure that I recognize everything that's on there and I'm not missing anything. Now, this is different than your credit score, right? So your credit score is more of a measure that they use to assess your credit worthiness. This credit report is part of that, right? But this is going to show all of the open lines of credit that you have. So any private loans, federal loans, credit cards, those sorts of things are all going to show up on that credit report. And then whether or not you're in good standing on all those accounts, that's what plays into your credit score, right? So knowing what's on your credit report is extremely helpful, because every bank that you're going to seek financing from is going to want to see that report, and they're going to pull it. And if there's something on there that they find that you didn't know about, that's always an awkward position to be in. Right, so make sure you know what's on here. That's where you can find identity theft too. If somebody grabs your social security number and opened a line of credit in your name, you'll find things like that on your credit report. They're not easy to fix, but the first step is identifying it. All right, so let's head over to studentaid.gov and let's make sure we know how to grab the student aid data file. Oops.
I'm just going to interject for a quick moment, Tony, and say, people are putting in some great questions. I also wanted to make sure I mentioned that if you see a question that you find relevant to one that you have, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, and that will upvote the question and put it to the top of the list. So go ahead and upvote any question that you want to make sure gets answered, and keep the questions coming as they are relevant to the presentation. We'll be announcing them live or answering them live, and if not live, at the end of the presentation. And any questions that you have, please put them in the Q&A window. Thanks so much.
Cool, thanks, Jordan. So this is going to be your kind of launching pad for getting all of your student loan repayment, at least your federal student loan repayment process started, right? So studentaid.gov. So here's going to be, there's some excellent information here about the pandemic relief, right? This is kind of my go-to when I'm looking for the latest and greatest and what the details are going to be on the restart of repayment when we get there, likely this October, and all of that sort of information. And there's actually a really good frequently asked questions in there, particularly catered to those of us that are using income-driven repayment. So that's a great resource on studentaid.gov. This is where you'll apply for your repayment plan, right? So you can see here the apply for income-driven repayment. If you're using an income-driven plan, you're going to have to renew or provide annual income documentation. This is where you do that also. If you're going to consolidate your loans, right? Again, I'm going to encourage everybody to do that. This is where you're going to start that process, right? So consolidate my loans. So the first step here is logging in. And you guys will get to see my student details. So I'm going to log in here. Not scary language. So this is going to drop you onto the dashboard that gives you a high level overview of everything that's in your student aid data file, right? So you can see here that I've got $163,000 of principal and about $7,700 of interest. So this is that unpaid interest. When I told you earlier that I'm making payments towards our student loans that don't cover the interest, this is where it ends up, right? It ends up in this separate interest bucket, but it doesn't end up on our principal, which we'll talk about later, right? So that's a benefit of income-driven repayment, is that that interest doesn't get added to your principal. I can see here I've got a couple of different loan servicers, Navient, Department of Ed, Great Lakes, right? But this isn't enough information for me to make any decisions. So I'm going to click on this View Details link. It's going to take me to another summary page, right? And this is the link I'm looking for, right? So download my aid data, right? This is what's going to get you your student aid data file. So if I click that link, right, it's going to try to save this text document to my computer somewhere. And that's what you're looking for. You're looking for that text document. Now, it's really hard to do this on a phone, right? So particularly if you've got like an iPhone, where iPhones don't really like you saving files from the interwebs, right? So this is probably best done on some kind of laptop or tablet device that allows you to download some files, right? So and when you're using a mobile device, sometimes they don't even show this link. So when it goes into the mobile view, they take that away, right? So if you're not seeing that, then you may want to try a different device to find that download my aid data file. All right, so just as a refresher, what are the interest rates, right? So the interest rates you borrowed for the last year of veterinary school, the direct unsubsidized loans were at 4.3%, so lowest they've ever been at that particular interest rate structure. If you had to borrow the direct grad plus loans, they're 1% higher, 5.3%, right? So that was for that last year of veterinary school. Health profession student loans and loans for disadvantaged students are always at 5%, and they never accrue interest while you're in school, right? Now, these loan types are what are called unsubsidized, meaning that they normally accrue interest while you're in school, but during the pandemic forbearance, they shut that off, right? So you didn't accrue interest on your direct loans since March 13th of 2020. These are just the details here. So again, this forbearance that we're in now is scheduled to end at the end of this September. I don't foresee them extending it any further. I mean, anything can happen, and anything has happened, but I don't anticipate seeing this get extended for any longer, which means that it's going, interest is going to start accruing again on October 1st. So does the pandemic forbearance change your student loan repayment plans? I've seen some questions come in. We've handled a lot of those on the VIN student debt message board folder. Do I really need to consolidate my loans now if I have a few more months here before the pandemic forbearance period ends? I would still say yes, right? Because again, now is a great time to take care of this. Stuff is going to happen and happen fast once you get to whatever your next position is going to be. And once you start learning to be a veterinarian, your student loans are going to fall way back in the, in the memory hole, right? So, and, you may get some reminders and such, but if you don't get the process started before the end of September, then it's quite likely that your loans are going to start accruing interest again. And then once you do end up in repayment, that interest is going to get added to your principal, which means you're going to end up paying more than you otherwise would have had to on your student loans. Another case for starting repayments sooner is so you get the clock ticking. Right? We'll talk a little bit more about metrics we use for determining whether or not you're likely to reach forgiveness. But for most graduating veterinarians, right, if your debt to income ratio is greater than 1, there's a chance that you're going to reach forgiveness, particularly if your debt to income ratio is greater than 2, right? So just based on all of the simulations that we've run over the last 10 years, that tends to be the case each time we run them, right? So if that is the case, I want to get that clock ticking as soon as possible, and I want that and the only way to do that is to end the grace period even during this pandemic forbearance, because that time that you're in your grace period now, right after graduation, does not count towards forgiveness, right? So those are the reasons why I think you need to end that grace period early. Okay, so here is if you do want some personalized assistance when it comes to formulating your repayment strategy, we have a VIN and VIN Foundation student debt message board folder. And as Rebecca was alluding to earlier, you can post anonymously in there, right? So the easiest way to do this is using that student aid data file in the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center that I'm going to show you here right now, right? So I'm going to come over to the Student Debt Center. Back to my web browser here. I'm going to go to vinfoundation.org/mystudentloans. And I'm going to take that student aid data file that I just saved to my computer. Right? You guys have graduated school, so I'm going to use this third box here. And I'm going to put the ones that I just created. There it is. This is a 2021 graduate from the Ohio State. And this is going to help to establish the summary of all your loans, show you all of your loan types. We can see that this person had one of these older Bell program loans in the past, but has since paid it off, right? So, but it also helps us see all of the different loan types that are in here. We can see that some of these are already in the grace period, which is great.
Tony, two questions that I think are relevant since you're in the student aid file.
Sure.
One is, how do we find our HPSL loans if they're not located on this federal student aid website, and can we consolidate them with our other loans?
Yeah, so I would look on your school financial aid account, right? So log into your the system that your school provides you for basically paying your tuition. You know, so at Colorado State, it was called RAMWeb, right? So when you log into your school account and you look at all things finance related to see if you have any outstanding balance, or you can go through your financial aid awards. Usually you'll be able to see that you have an outstanding balance with the school that falls into that health profession student loan category, right? And that you're going to need to locate those details to do exactly what you asked about, right? So to take those loans and consolidate them with your direct loans, you're going to need to know what the balance is for those loans. And sometimes your school will even move those loans to a different loan servicer, right? So your school administers them while you're in school, and then after you graduate, they'll send them to a loan servicer, right? That then monitor those student loans and the payments that are associated with them, right? So look in your school financial aid account to start first, and see if you can find them there. Your credit report is another good place that you can try to locate those loans as well and see who holds them. But yes, you can consolidate. You can consolidate them with your federal direct loans.
Two more questions. One, the Grad Plus loans are not the same as the Parent Plus loans, correct?
That is correct. Yeah, grad plus loans you'll find in your file, right? So we've got a good example here, direct plus graduate loans. I call them grad plus loans, it's easier to say. But direct plus graduate loans are the loans that you borrowed, right? Under your social security number, right? So you filled out the FAFSA, they provided those loans and they're under your name and social security number. The parent plus loans are loans your parents took out to help you fund your likely undergrad education, and they're going to be in your parents' studentaid.gov account under their information, right? Yeah, so those are very different. Now, if you were a parent, right, and I occasionally see this, right? If you had kids of your own and you were helping to finance their college educations and you had parent plus loans for your children, you would find them in your file, right? And they would show up as another category in this file. But it happens occasionally, but not terribly frequently, right?
Okay, two more questions. One, are private student loans more like traditional loans? For example, can I pay more on the principal and actually pay less interest?
Yeah, great question. Maybe, right? You have to, that's where that promissory note's going to come in handy with your private student loan. Most private student loans don't have a prepayment penalty, which is essentially what you're referring to there, but some will, right? So you have to look that up in the details of that specific loan. Some of them will not, or if you do pay them off ahead of schedule, they will actually charge you a fee for that, right? So you want to see if there's any kind of prepayment penalty. It's pretty rare, but they do exist. Federal student loans don't have any kind of prepayment penalty, right? We know that because, again, all of those promissory notes are public information and everybody's subject to those same terms and conditions. Coming back to the My Student Loans thing really quick here, I wanted to show you this income-driven repayment eligibility tab, right? This is probably the most important tab that's in here, right? Because the income-driven plans are the ones that have the goofy qualification requirements. You can pretty much pick any other type of traditional repayment plan that you want, but the income-driven plans really depend on the loan types you have and when you started borrowing, right? So we see here that this person is eligible for the old version of IVR, which my wife and I started with. They're also eligible for pay as you earn, which is great. And they're eligible for revised pay as you earn, which is a plan my wife and I are using. And the reason why my wife and I are using repay is because we don't qualify for pay, right? And I believe the same is true for Rebecca. Chime in and correct me if I'm wrong. But in certain instances, you may not be eligible for pay as you earn depending on when you started school and when you started borrowing, right? So the first thing you want to check is whether or not you're eligible for pay as you earn, right? Now, it's less and less frequent unless you're a career changer at this point, which this person may be, right? Because they have a loan from 2004, which means, you know, they spent some time in school before they found their way into vet school. But they still meet the eligibility requirements to use pay as you earn. Generally speaking, if you have some older loans, particularly loans from before 2007, and you hadn't paid them to zero before you started borrowing again, then you won't be eligible for pay as you earn. But I want you to check first to see if you're eligible to use pay as you earn, because this is, generally speaking, the most beneficial of the income-driven plans that are out there. Right, so first step is knowing whether or not you're eligible to use pay as you earn. Coming back to the real reason why I came over here, right, was to help get you to the student debt folder, right, the place where we do personalized consultations. So you'll see here that it says hi visitor, right, and that's because I'm not logged in, but I can log in with my VIN, username, and password. And when I upload the files, once I'm logged in, it'll save that information in there for me, right? So I'm going to upload this one now. And so now, as you can see, it knows who I am now, right? So it's got my VIN profile, essentially. And now it'll save this file under my VIN profile, but it's got a link here to the student debt folder, right? And this will take you to the message board system within VIN, which is, you know, kind of the heart and soul of VIN, right? Which is veterinarians helping other veterinarians. We're all helping each other here. But this is where we, you know, also kind of borrow from that veterinarians helping veterinarians with clinical cases, and we apply that same concept to student loans, right? So you post your student debt and income signalment in here. You can do so anonymously or non-anonymously, right? You can, it's your choice. And then we walk through your student loan details, questions, and help you understand what your repayment options are. This is actually a really interesting one because this is a person who's trying to figure out how she's not only going to pay back her student loans, but she also wants to pay back her dad's loans, the Parent Plus loans that he borrowed to help her get through undergraduate, right? So that's going to take some planning, right? But this is how we wade through all of that information and those details, and you can learn from these, right? So you can search certain parameters. If you're looking for, say, Parent Plus loans, this will come up in the VIN search, and you can see how we handle those. And if you don't get the answer you need, you can then post the questions that you have, and we'll go through these in detail in terms of helping you answer the questions and establish those repayment plans.
And Tony, do you want to mention that anybody can access this as well?
Yeah, so anybody can. So obviously, you know, you all have access to VIN for free as students, and VIN has extended that free access for additional months due to, again, kind of the weird pandemic scenario that we're all living through. So you have access to the VIN student debt folder, but even if you don't have access to VIN in the future, we can still make sure that you can see the post that you've made in the past and get that help through the VIN Foundation. So we also have a VIN Foundation version of the student debt message board folder. Still uses your same VIN username and password, but it provides you access to that message board system for student debt specific questions, right? So you'll always have access and the availability of getting that assistance, whether you have an active VIN membership or not. Any other questions on that stuff? Any other ones you see there that, Jordan, that fall into that universe?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot specifically about the different plans, but I know that you're going to get into some of that. And a lot of married questions, and then choosing grace periods, et cetera. But our favorite question, which somebody always asks, which is it even possible to get PSLF after 10 years? Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of this you're going to cover. So
cool. Great. So, I mean, we've already gone through this part, but, so grab your file, save it to your computer, upload it into the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center. If you're logged into VIN, you only have to do that once, at least for now, right? You can work with that file, but now is most important because you're going to craft that repayment strategy based on what your student loan information says now. Answering the question, which plans can I use? That's going to be that My Student Loans tool and that income-driven repayment eligibility tab. And then which plan should you use, which is kind of what Jordan's alluding to. That's where we're going to get into the loan repayment simulator, right? We're going to let the numbers kind of decide. Now, we did see that 0% interest rate is showing on our file, right? So we're going to have to estimate what our overall interest rate is. You can see what your interest rates are if you start the direct loan consolidation process. That's the only place I found right now that you can actually still access your interest rates is through the direct consolidation loan process. And I'll show you that in just a few minutes. So why do we want to start a direct consolidation loan? I talked about this a little bit already, but it helps you end this grace period early. This grace period is not helping you, right? And that used to be the case before we had income-driven repayment, but that grace period is not very helpful anymore. Now, again, you guys are in a little bit of a gray zone, unique to the fact that you graduated into this pandemic and the fact that it's due to end, this forbearance period is due to end in the middle of your grace period, which is also not helpful. So I want to get my loans consolidated into repayment before I get thrown into the chaos that's going to ensue on October 1st, right? And I use that lightly. I think the student loan repayment system was never meant to be turned on and off like a switch. And we're going to find out how ineffective that switch is on October 1st. You don't want to be trying to figure out what status your loans are in on October 1st when everybody and their brother is calling their loan servicer trying to figure out what they need to do next, right? So use this time you have now to do what we know works, right? So consolidate your student loans, end the grace period, choose an income-driven repayment plan, and you essentially buy yourself a minimum of 12 months of time here with low or no payment, right? And then hopefully in another year or so, we're going to be on something that resembles normalcy again, right? But it also buys you, not only buys you time, but it buys you cash flow, right? So you'll have a $0 payment if you do this before you start your job, or if you've got a tax return on file that you can use, right? You'll essentially extend your grace period, right? But the bigger benefit is this $0 monthly payment will actually count towards forgiveness, right? It counts towards something. You're actually in a repayment plan as opposed to your grace period, right? And you don't want to find out on November 1st or December 1st that you've got that standard 10-year plan payment due because the forbearance period is ended and you don't have the funds to cover that, right? So again, I think there's way more pros than cons to ending your grace period, even with the pandemic forbearance that's in place through September. You're going to get a chance during the consolidation process to choose your loan servicer. And that may not seem like a big deal, but a couple of these loan servicers are known to be pretty terrible, right? Nelnet, Navient, I would say, are the worst of the worst. Now, these two are not great by any means, but given the choice, I'm always going to choose Fed Loan Servicing, and this is the only opportunity you're going to have to choose your loan servicer is through the consolidation process. Fed Loan Servicing, again, they're not good at this, but they are the official monitor of public service loan forgiveness, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and that requires you to use income-driven repayment. So they do tend to have the most experience with income-driven repayment questions, right? So take advantage of that opportunity to choose a loan servicer and then choose Fed loan servicing. The only cons that I can really conjure up of the consolidation is that, yes, it's paperwork, right? And once you start it, you're going to have to follow it through to completion. And sometimes you have to correct mistakes that they make during the consolidation process, but I still think that's all worth it. You will, if you include those health profession student loans or loans for disadvantaged students, you'll lose the grace period that they have. They have a little bit longer grace period. But again, I still think that the pros outweigh the cons in that instance. And you also lose the opportunity to pay directly towards specific loans, right? So a consolidation essentially is going to take all of these loans, right? So if we come back to our example here, this person has 24 different loans, or 23 of them that have a balance, right? It's going to take all 23 of these loans and put them into a single loan, right? And they're going to calculate a weighted average interest rate. So the interest rate is essentially the same. It's the same as if you left them all unconsolidated, except it's going to be represented by a single loan as opposed to these 23 different loans. Right? So you do lose that ability to make, targeted payments towards specific loans, which some people like to do as part of a strategy, but for your federal student loans, I don't find that it works very well at all. Right? So I still think you're better off consolidating your student loans. And the earlier you start this, the better. Right? I used the example when we started of a 2020 graduate who started the consolidation process, but it didn't complete all the way, right? Half of her loans ended up getting consolidated, the other half did not, right? That's a mess, right? So now she's got some harder decisions to make this year. So I want to get that started, follow it through to its completion now, so I don't have to worry about my loans again for another year. All right, so let's come back over to the website and I'll show you how you can actually consolidate. So I'm logged in now, right? I'll take you as far as this system will let me do without consolidating my loans again, which I don't want to do. So I want to hit the consolidate my loans. I was going to make me log in again. I did get timed out.
So Tony, while you're going ahead and do this, I'm going to ask a couple questions.
Sure.
Is it possible to consolidate federal loans with private loans?
It is not. So you cannot consolidate private loans with your federal consolidation loan. You could do a private consolidation of your private loans and also include your federal loans, but I wouldn't recommend that, right? That's not a good idea. So you can consolidate your federal loans, and you still should, to try to get them into the most flexible repayment plan you can, and then use that flexibility you have with your federal student loans to target the private loans and pay them down faster, right? Because those private loans are ultimately less flexible, right? So I want to try to eliminate that balance sooner than I would try to eliminate my federal balance, even if the federal balance is higher, right? The federal balance comes with much more flexibility because you have this ability to adjust the payments up or down based on your income.
Another question. So when we consolidate our loans, we immediately end pandemic forbearance and need to start making payments immediately instead of in September?
Oh, that's a great question. No, you're not actually. So you consolidate your loans, and it's going to take all of your dozens of loans that you have and roll them into a brand new loan. But that brand new loan is still impacted by the pandemic forbearance. So if you've got your consolidation, typically takes 30 days, at worst case scenario, 60 days. So if you get your loans into repayment by July 1st, right, you're still going to benefit from the pandemic forbearance for July, August, September, right? You'll be in a repayment plan, which is what you want. You want the loan servicer to reflect that you're no longer in your grace period. You're actually in a repayment plan, but you're still not accruing interest and you still have no payment due because of the pandemic forbearance, right? So you don't end the pandemic forbearance period. Yeah, great question though.
One other question just had,
yeah.
One person said, how again did you navigate to this once you logged into your studentaid.gov file?
So studentaid.gov, under manage loans, consolidate my loans. So studentaid.gov, look for the manage loans tab, and then you're going to see consolidate my loans is under there. And you can see that this one finds all of the loans that I have in my student aid data file, right? So these are the 4 main groups that I have. Now I've already consolidated my loans, so that's what this group is. But I still do have a couple of older federal family education loans that I didn't consolidate originally, and they're with Navient, and they have very small balances, right? These are my R&D loans, right? I keep these just so I can keep an eye on what Navient's doing, right? So, and they have extremely low interest rates, because back when I borrowed these in the dark ages of the 90s, the interest rate structure was very, very different for federal student loans than it is now, right? So I'm not too terribly worried about carrying a small balance on these loans, and it helps me learn what Navient's doing. But here's where you can see your interest rates again, right? This is the only place that I'm aware of right now in the entire federal system that you can actually see your interest rates, is if you start this consolidation process, right? So if you do that, you'll get to see what your interest rates are again.
Okay, 2 things you're
yep.
here, and a couple people have these questions, which are, when can we consolidate if you have HPSL?
So you have to, in order to put federal student loans into a consolidation, they have to at least be in their grace period, right? So for your direct loans, the direct unsubsidized loans, if I come back to this one, right, that's where this repayment plan status helps you. I can see, let me go to the loan types. So the direct Stafford unsubsidized, these are the first ones you need to worry about, right? That loan type needs to say grace period. And that happens, I've seen it happen for some graduates as soon as 2 days after they graduated, right? And for this person, it's already happened as well, right? So these loans are in their grace period. They can be included in a consolidation. Your direct plus graduate loans can always be consolidated, because they don't technically have a grace period, and they're either always in a repayment status or in a deferment status, which is also eligible for consolidation. So you don't have to wait for your direct grad plus loans to change status at all, right? They're always available to be put into a consolidation. The health profession student loan can be a little sticky, right? They typically take a little bit longer for them to be reflected in their grace period. So if you graduated in early May, I would hope that they're going to be in their grace period by June 1st, but you may not see them enter their grace period until the end of June, right? So that would probably be the worst case scenario. Couple of options there. You can either wait until your health profession student loans, if you have them, are actually in their grace period and then start the consolidation, or you can start the consolidation and add the health profession student loans to the consolidation later once they are in their grace period. That second version is a little bit more administratively difficult, right? But you can take that road if you want. The simpler way to go is just wait until the health profession student loans are in their grace period. And at that point, your unsubsidized loans should already be in the grace period, and then you can just consolidate everything.
Okay, a couple more things. One, how do you check if your loans are in the grace period?
Yeah, so obtain the student aid data file and upload it into here, right? And look at this repayment plan status, right? Particularly for the direct unsubsidized loans, right? We need them to say grace period.
Okay, and then are you able to change your loan servicer?
Yes. Yep. So that's part of this. Now, just another note on the health profession student loans in here, you're going to have to add them manually, right? So that's where you need to find where they are, if they're with your school in the school financial aid account, or if they're with the new servicer already at this point. But this is where you're going to add those health profession student loans or loans for disadvantaged students, right? There's a whole laundry list of the loan types that you can add to the consolidation. Health profession student loans are on here, right? Loans for disadvantaged students are on here, right? So that you're going to fill in the details that they're looking for in this add loans feature. You're going to need that account number, right? These are required fields, right? This is why you got to locate those loans and put the amounts that are in there, right? So the Department of Education can actually go find those loans and consolidate them.
Okay, another question. When speaking to a loan officer, they warn me that consolidating will add the interest we have already accrued into the principal balance, and therefore will be paying interest on the interest already accrued. Should we be concerned about this?
Yeah, so that is a true statement, but that's going to happen regardless, right? And that's one of the, again, one of the pros for consolidating, right? So consolidation will take your unpaid interest and add it to the principal. It has to, right? Because it's going to take all the outstanding balance. It's going to create a new loan with a new principal and a weighted average interest rate made up of all those other loans. If you don't do anything with your loans, right? If you let the grace period expire, the interest will start accruing again on October 1st. Maybe you've got another 2 months of your grace period, which means you're going to have 2 more months of interest. Once that grace period ends, that's another trigger for adding the unpaid interest to your principal. There's no way around that, right? The way that the federal student loans are set up is that your interest that you accrue during school will get added to your principal either through consolidation or when you start repayment if you don't consolidate, right? So that's going to happen regardless of the path you choose. If you force it to happen earlier, your principal balance will actually be lower, right? Which means you'll accrue less interest over time, which is why I'm a proponent of consolidating as soon as you can and ending the grace period, because you don't want any more interest to accrue that can then ultimately get added to your principal.
Another question, what if it does not say grace period, but you have graduated? Are you saying that this should be updated by June?
Yeah, I would, if it's, if you just graduated recently, then give it to the end of the month here, right? Give it till June 1st. And I would suspect that your loan should say grace period by then. If you graduated from a foreign veterinary school, that's not always the case. For some reason, I can't explain it. It does seem like the foreign school graduates that it's a little stickier. It takes longer for that grace period to take effect, right? If that's the case, then you can reach out to your school and see if your school financial aid office will be willing to report that you graduated to the Department of Education and kind of force that grace period status. That's essentially what is required, is the school needs to report that you've officially graduated so the Department of Education can say, okay, it's time to start the grace period. And for some reason, I see that happen with, the vet school in Europe and Ireland and even in Canada. For some reason, those grace periods take a little bit longer to trigger for students graduating from those schools. All right, so how do you end the grace period early? This is where you're going to do this. Processing delay. Do not delay processing. So when I say end the grace period early, this is the option you're looking for, right? Do not delay processing. That means that they're going to process that consolidation as soon as you've signed the form, essentially. Servicer selection. They're going to ask you a question about public service loan forgiveness. If you're heading into an academic internship or otherwise working for a public service, you can hit yes. Or if you see yourself doing that in the future, go ahead and hit yes. That really doesn't do anything here, but go ahead and click that button. This is where you're going to get a chance to choose your loan servicer, right? Federal loan servicers. There's going to be a list of them here. If you already have Fed loan servicing, you can just choose them again. If you have any other loan servicer, then I would recommend choosing Fed loan servicing. Right? So this is going to be that one shot you get at choosing your federal loan servicer. I'm going to hit continue. This is where they're going to ask you some questions about your income. Let's say that you got a job, your first job, somebody that posted earlier this week, $97,000. I think they're working in Arizona. Family size of 1. Your tax filing status, right? It's going to play into this. And once you start filling that stuff out, it's going to give you some repayment plan estimates, right? So these are all the variety of different repayment plans you can choose. The graduated plans come up a lot this year. I don't know why. For some reason, it seems like when some of you guys are doing your exit counseling, and even some of the financial counselors that are responsible at your schools are recommending graduated plans. Don't ever pick a graduated plan, right? You will pay the maximum amount you can possibly pay using a graduated plan, right? Those things are terribly useless, particularly now that the income-driven plans are available. So stay away from those graduated plans. Here's where they're going to try to do some estimates for your income-driven plans, but these are pretty unreliable. right? Which is why we had to build the simulator, so we can actually change some of the projections and come up with some better and more accurate projections. But essentially, this is going to give you the list of options that are available. And if you choose an income-driven plan, right, this is where you're going to come down and say, after my consolidation is complete, which repayment plan do I want to use, right? And this is where you have to know which ones you're eligible for and which one you actually want to use, right? Because there's not a put me in the best one that you think is possible option in here, even though you wouldn't want to use that anyway, right? You want to pick the plan that's going to be the best for you and know why you're choosing it, right? And you have to fill it in here on that selection box, right? So if I select pay as you earn, right, this is what's then going to ask me about my family size, my income, how am I going to generate the monthly payment based on this pay as you earn schedule. You work for a nonprofit, right? So again, if you're heading into an academic internship or you're working for a nonprofit after graduation, then hit yes. Family size, right? How many children do you have? No, I don't. If you have children, you can put that in there. Other dependents, so these would be people that are living in your house that you support. If you're married, single, right? And this, it's most helpful, and this is as far as I can take you, it's most helpful if you have a tax return on file. Now, based on those of you that submitted the student debt and income signalment forms, 78% of you told me that you did, right? So if you have a tax return on file, this is where you're going to link it, right? So if you link that tax return, it'll use the income from that tax return to calculate your monthly payment for that pay-as-you-earn plan. And if that income on your tax return is, as long as it's less than about $20,000 for the 2020 tax year, then your payment will be zero. Right? So that's, if you have that tax return on file and it's less than $20,000, which I suspect it is for most of you, then your payment will be zero for the first 12 months that you're in pay-as-you-earn using that method. Now, if you don't have a tax return on file, you can exit out of this and you'll have to provide alternative documentation of income. Now, if you haven't started your job yet, you can actually check a box that says, I don't have any income, right? And if you haven't started your job yet, that's true. You don't have any income, right? And they will still set your payment to zero for the first 12 months. So that's how you can achieve a $0 monthly payment for the first 12 months, which is longer than your grace period and more beneficial. Clear as mud. All right, well, we already started the process, so let's skip over that. We're going to talk about.
There's a question here that's talking about spouse income. Do we include our spouse's income as part of our repayment estimate, or just adjusted gross income? Sorry.
So if you're, and that gets back to this application. So if I go back, if it'll let me go back, let's see if it'll let me go back. No, it's going to do here. That's where those questions about, are you married, come in, right? What is your marital status at the time of this application, right? If you're married, right, then that presumes you probably have a joint tax return on file, right? Or unless you filed separately. I mean, if you filed separately, then and you choose pay as you earn, then you don't have to include your spouse's income. But if you indicate that you're married and your most recent tax return was filed as jointly, then when you link to the IRS, it's going to pull in that joint adjusted gross income. Right? Now, if that's an overestimate of your current income situation, then you can choose not to use that. And again, you're in that alternative documentation of income situation. But it's all based on your marital status and how you filed your most recent tax return as a married couple. So the income-driven plans compared against a time-driven plan. Right, so a time-driven plan, these are basically traditional repayment methods, right? So principal, interest, and then the duration that you're going to pay the loans back is what determines the monthly payment. People like these, right? We're very familiar with them. It's how loans work for 99% of financing that has ever been done, right? The monthly payment's a fixed cost. Usually, if it's a fixed interest rate, I know exactly how much I'm going to pay if I make 120 monthly payments over a 10-year period, or if I extend it out to 20 years and do 240 monthly payments, or like a mortgage is 30 years and 360 monthly payments, right? I know exactly how much I'm going to pay if I do that payment schedule. The income-driven plans are completely different, right? They don't really care about the amount that you borrowed. They care more about your income, tax filing status, and marital status, and family size, right? So the payment is a function of all of those things, of how much taxable income you have, your family size, and then whether or not you're married and filed a joint tax return. That's what's going to determine your monthly payment. Now, this can change and does change over time, right? As you're not earning very much, right? Or if you have a low tax return on file that you can get a $0 monthly payment, you're not going to pay very much. But as your taxable income increases, your monthly payment is going to increase, right? This leads to a variable cost structure that is very difficult to project and know how much exactly it's going to cost. And oh, by the way, if I hit that maximum repayment period, I might have to pay a tax on forgiveness. Right, so this is generally what tends to drive people crazy, is that it's the unknown, right? There's lots of unknowns associated with it. However, it can be quite flexible when it comes to veterinary situations, particularly as you're getting started. And this is where we have the loan repayment simulator comes in handy, right? So we'll go do an example of that in just a bit. I just want to go through a few more of the income-driven repayment features. I also want to use this as an opportunity to just introduce the fact that just because you can maybe get a lower interest rate on a private loan refinance, I keep seeing news articles come across my feed that say private loan refinance rates have never been lower, and that may be true, right? But that's probably still not going to result in a lower monthly payment for you. And it may not even result in a lower total cost, right? So student loans, unfortunately, go way beyond interest rates. When it comes to comparing an income-driven repayment projection versus what you would pay at a lower interest rate with a private loan, they're completely different animals, right? So you have to be very, very careful about that.
Yeah, there are a couple people asking about Sophie.
Yeah, so anything specific?
Just, should we use Sophie? What do you think about Sophie?
Yeah, so well, first of all, if you go to apply for a private loan refinance right now as new veterinary graduates with very limited credit history and probably, you know, a lower credit score, you're probably not going to get that great of an interest rate anyway. And they're likely going to entice you to bring a cosigner to the table, either a spouse or a family member, somebody that does have a little bit more robust credit history than you do. And that's dangerous, right? And as I just kind of discussed, you know, student loans are about way more than interest rates. I would want to get a little bit more knowledge of my career path and understanding of my income as a veterinarian before I make that call to refinance my federal student loans with a private lender, right? Because that's an undoable activity. You know, once you do that, there is no going back. And there's this chart, while it is kind of nausea inducing because it highlights all of the differences among the different repayment plans, there is an amazing amount of flexibility in here, right? And if I know anything, is that new grads experience a lot of variability in the first few years after graduation, right? A lot of you change jobs after just a few months, or, you know, if you make it a year, that's pretty good, right? If you're doing an internship, maybe you're going to apply for a residency. That's an unknown. Am I going to get the residency? What happens if I do? What happens if I don't? Right? I mean, there's lots of unknowns in those first few years after graduation. You don't want to lock yourself into some fixed repayment just because you might get a lower interest rate when you don't really know what your income is going to be doing for the first few years. Right? So have a little bit better understanding of that, and then we'll talk about how you can use your debt to income ratio to help you make that decision as well.
So one other question that we're seeing a couple of, which is, can you speak to how your credit score affects your loan, is affected by your loan consolidation? Like, will it impact you trying to get a home? I know this is one of your favorite stories to tell.
Yeah, well, so no, and it won't negatively impact your credit score, right? Now, it's you don't have, most likely, I guess it depends. I mean, that's another good reason to pull your credit history. The longer you're going to have a history of credit, you know, probably the more robust your credit score is going to be, provided you don't have a lot of delinquencies or you know, non-payments on that credit history, right? But if you don't, if you've just kind of started building your credit, then you don't have much of a credit history nor a credit score, right? Now, your student loans can actually help you with that, right? So once you get them into a repayment plan, right, they'll start, you know, chronicling that on your credit history, And if they see that you're in good standing, even in an income-driven repayment plan, that helps to build your credit, right? So it's not going to hurt your credit using or having student loans or using an income-driven repayment plan. Right, I'll talk about that. I'll talk about the specifics of mine when it comes to like home loan financing a little bit later there. But no, the getting started on your student loan repayment can actually help you build your credit score.
So another quick question is people are asking what should they base their AGI on? Their 2020 tax return or new salary at future job? Do they like when should they file versus when should they submit the previous year tax return or current year, and what's the sort of time frame of that works most to their benefit?
Yeah, so if you're in this system, right, and when it says link to the IRS, right, it's looking for your most recent tax return, right? So if you filed one for 2020, that's the one they're going to use. Right? If you didn't file one for 2020, because maybe you didn't have to, maybe you filed one for 2019, they'll accept that too. But you can only go back a maximum of 2 tax filing years for income-driven repayment using a tax return. The tax return is kind of you can think of it as the gold standard, right? They will always accept your most recently filed tax return, right? Always. Now you need to decide if that's the best documentation for you to use at that time, right? Because the next question that happens after they process this is, has your income significantly decreased since you filed that recent tax return, right? If you answer no, then they'll use the tax return. If you answer yes, then you'll provide them some other documentation that says that my income is lower than my most recently filed tax return, right? They don't care if it's higher, right? They only care if it's lower. So you can use that rule to your advantage, right? I always use the tax return if it's the lowest representation of my most recent taxable income, always, right? But if for some reason, and this is probably unlikely to happen for you all, but maybe for in the future, right? If I filed a tax return after a really good income year I had, but now I'm taking maternity leave or I'm moving and changing jobs and I've got a period off of 2 or 3 months and not earning income, well, now the answer to that question is my income is currently significantly decreased since I last filed my tax return. So I'm going to provide some different documentation that shows a lower number, right? That's how the income-driven plans are catered and designed in such a way to provide student loan monthly payment relief, right? They're not trying to penalize you, right? They're trying to free up money in your budget so student loans aren't a punishing part of that budget, right? So use that structure to your advantage, right? And that's why it's so valuable. If you've heard any of the climbing Mount Debt sessions we do with students, I encourage all students to file a tax return before they graduate. Now we're past that window now, right? So you either have one or you don't, right? But you can still, if you didn't file a tax return and you're in between graduation and your job, you have that option to say, well, I don't have any taxable income yet because I haven't started my job, right? So, as long as, if you received a signing bonus and they actually gave it to you already, right? Now you could use that as documentation of your income because you physically received that income already. Right? But if you have not received any income and you've not started your job yet, you technically don't yet have any taxable income. So you can check the box that says I don't have any, and they'll set your payment to 0 for the first 12 months. Okay, so how do they calculate your payment normally, right? They use a measure called discretionary income. And depending on the plan that you choose, it will be a percentage of that discretionary income, right? So what does that look like? So 10% of my discretionary income, if I use a plan like Pay, the new version of IVR, or Revise Pay As You Earn, right? So those are the plans that are 10% of your discretionary income. So they're going to take your taxable income. In most cases, this is going to be that adjusted gross income right off of your tax return, right? Your adjusted gross income is actually specified in the law for income-driven repayment in terms of the measure that's supposed to be used for documenting your taxable income, right? So they're going to pull that right off of your tax return, the adjusted gross income. Subtract off 150% of the federal poverty guidelines, which you can look up, right? It's based on your family size. So if we have $100,000 of income and a family size of 1, right, just plugging the numbers into that equation, my discretionary income is $80,680. Under a plan like Pay As You Earn or Revised Pay As You Earn, 10% of that discretionary income is $672 per month. Right? That's what my income requires me to pay. Right? Now, this is what I want you to compare against what you told me you're expecting to pay towards your student loans. Right? In most cases, I would say 90% of the time, this mathematical calculation number is lower than what you're expecting to pay towards your student loans. Right? Don't pay more than you have to. Right? You can do better things with that money, particularly as you're getting started in your veterinary career. So first question you need to answer, how much does your income require you to pay? Right? Your taxable income. But what is missing from this calculation? Right? When I mentioned it earlier, right? Your student debt balance isn't in this equation. Right? So whether you have $100,000 of student loans in this example, or $400,000 of student loans in this example, the monthly payment is going to be the same. Right? Now the side effects are going to be different. Right? The person that has $100,000 of student loans, this will be close to covering the interest. Right? The person that has $400,000 of student loans, this isn't even going to be close to covering the interest. Right? So it's what happens to your loans after that causes the issue when using income-driven repayment based on the amount that you borrow. All right, so most of you told me that you expected to pay more than $1,000 per month, right? Which again is pretty typical, right? And sometimes that number is even higher, right, on average. So, you can pay less. Your income will allow you to pay less towards your student loans, right? And some of you have some really, really, really well-intentioned amounts to pay towards your student loans. I mean, I hope you have that kind of cash flow to generate that, right? But even if you do, there's probably better things you can do with that money than paying down your student loans. All right, so let's talk a little bit about forgiveness, particularly public service loan forgiveness, right? So I think that question came up a little bit earlier. Public service loan forgiveness is a little bit different animal. It uses income-driven repayment, but there are other requirements, right? And federal direct loans, right? So that's another reason why I want you to consolidate your loans, because you never know where your career may take you. And if you end up in something that resembles public service, right, you want to make sure that you have all direct loans and you aren't in a position to try to fix that later, right? It's always easier to consolidate now before you actually enter repayment than it is to fix this later, right? So consolidate, clean up all the messiness, get all of your loans into a direct consolidation loan, right? Because that will make them eligible for public service loan forgiveness. Then you choose an income-driven repayment plan, right? That's the payment plan you use as you're working towards public service loan forgiveness. And then the last requirement that everybody seems to be familiar with is that I have to work for a state, federal, local, or nonprofit, 501c3 specifically. Right? This is the type of nonprofit that's specified in the law. You do have to average 30 hours per week and be a full-time. Well, you have to be an employee. You can't be a contractor. That comes up particularly with shelters. You have to be an employee and meet the full-time average requirement, which is 30 hours per week. And so if you do all of these things, then you are making qualifying payments towards public service loan forgiveness. And if you do that for 120 months, then you can apply to have the remaining balance of your student loans forgiven. And it won't be taxed, right? So this is tax-free forgiveness automatically, right? So if you qualify for this and they grant you forgiveness, you will not have to pay tax on whatever amount is forgiven. Any additional questions on public service loan forgiveness?
No, I don't see any more specifically around that.
I see a raised hand. Is that? See a couple of raised hands. Is that something that, does that mean you want to ask a question about that?
I'll chat with her and see what she says.
Great. Thank you. All right, so the best repayment plan. So this is probably the most common question. What is the best repayment plan? So in my opinion, the best repayment plan is the one that's going to allow you to reduce the risk to yourself and your family, maximize your monthly cash flow, and ultimately minimize your total repayment costs. Now, most of you are focused on this third bullet. In my opinion, these two trump that third bullet, right? I want these two because this is what reduces uncertainty, reduces risk to myself, is essentially like having insurance for my student loans, right? These are more important, in my opinion, than this one. Now, in some cases, a lot of cases actually, you can get all three of these, right? Depending on your debt to income ratio, which we're going to talk about next, right? But if I don't necessarily get this third one, it's okay to a point, right? I mean, I'm not going to pay a significant amount more if I don't have to, right? But usually these two are going to outweigh this third one. And if I can get this third one, then bonus. So what is it? Reducing the risk to myself and my family? What does that mean, right? Your student loans don't require a cosigner, right? So nobody else is ever on the hook for your student loans if for some reason you can never pay them back, right? If you become disabled, or even worst case scenario, you should die, those loans go away, right? Nobody else is ever responsible to pay them. That's not necessarily the case with a lot of private loans or any refinance, particularly if they rope a cosigner into it, right? So you have to be really careful about that. Maximizes cash flow, right? So a lot of you told me you want to pay $1,000 per month, but your income only requires you to pay $672, right? I can do better things with that additional $300 per month than paying it towards my student loans, right? That's how I'm going to free up my cash flow. And that's also how I know how much I should pay towards my student loans. I do find that that's probably one of the most common sources of confusion for most veterinarians when it comes to student loans, is how much do they need to pay versus how much they should pay, right? And to me, this takes out all of the mystery, right? 10% of my discretionary income. So if my income goes up, my payment will go up. My income goes down, my payment goes down, right? I don't have to worry about what's some magical number that I need to pay above that, right? I'll pay what my income requires me to pay, and I'm going to do other things with that cash flow. And then ultimately minimizes my total repayment costs. And that's where the debt to income ratio and the loan repayment simulator is going to come in. I want to make sure that everybody's clear on this, right? So if you can consolidate your loans and get into an income driven repayment and have $0 payment for the first 12 months, right? That same concept will apply for the second 12 months, right? So as a fourth year veterinary student, if you filed a tax return and that tax return shows a low number, you've got a $0 payment for the first 12 months. You guys are now starting your jobs halfway through this tax year, right? So think through that. When you file your 2021 tax return, right? If you're going to be making the equivalent of 100 grand a year with your first job out of school, you're going to have a tax return for 2021 that shows about $50,000 of adjusted gross income, right? Which means your payment under an income-driven repayment strategy is going to be significantly lower even for the second 12 months. That frees up a ton of cash flow, right? That's how you can build an emergency fund. You can save for a home. You can save for a practice. You can start a family. You can maximize your retirement savings, right? All of those things are going to come from the fact that you're not paying more than your income requires towards your student loans. And we'll show you that in the simulator. So debt to income ratios, and this is where, again, these are guidelines, rules of thumb. I know that these can be a little bit dangerous. However, after running thousands and thousands and thousands of simulations, there are some themes that present themselves, right? Your student debt to income ratio, if it's less than 1, then you're not going to hit forgiveness, right? Probability is, unless you have some major interruption to your income, you're not going to hit forgiveness. Right? Now, you can choose to still use income-driven repayment as a strategy to jumpstart your financial wellness, right? You can still benefit from all these things we're talking about. And that's where repay comes in really handy, is in these low debt-to-income ratio scenarios where you're likely to pay the balance off to zero before reaching forgiveness, right? Because repay, we didn't really get into this a lot, but repay has an unpaid interest subsidy, right? So if you're not making payments for the first 12 months and you're making low payments for the second 12 months, if those payments aren't covering the interest, the government will actually cover half of that interest for you. And if you ultimately end up paying the loan to zero, that can help reduce your total cost, while still providing you that cash flow flexibility in those first 2 years to jumpstart that financial wellness plan, right? So you're using this as a repayment strategy in this case, right? To, you may end up paying a little bit more in total towards your student loans, but that additional cash flow and the boost to your financial wellness is way worth that additional cost of your student loans. If your debt to income ratio is greater than 1, which is the case for the overwhelming majority of veterinary graduates, right, then choose an income-driven plan, most likely pay as you earn, pay the minimum, plan for forgiveness, and reassess as your income changes and it becomes more clear what you're going to be doing within veterinary medicine.
Tony, a lot of people are asking, do you absolutely need to consolidate loans in order to be able to do an IDR?
You don't need to, but it's the best way to get started, right? Because you're going to start that clock sooner. You're going to assure that you buy some more time, right? This is that time where you can get that $0 monthly payment for 12 months as opposed to just the duration of your grace period. And again, when that grace period ends, it's usually abrupt, right? They don't really do a whole lot of communication with you. They just send you a statement. And that default standard 10-year monthly payment plan is what they're going to require. So, again, I'm going to still encourage you to consolidate your loans versus not, right? There's too many things that I've seen that go wrong with waiting versus consolidating and making sure that I'm in repayment for that first 12 months. So what does your taxable income need to be in order for your monthly payment under a plan like pay or repay to equal a standard 10-year monthly payment amount, right? So this to me is kind of the eye opener. It's going to depend on your student debt balance. So think about this in terms of your student debt balance, right? But we can use this as an introduction to the simulator. So if I come back to here and we use this as an example. So we've got a person that's going to have a starting repayment balance of about $342,000. I'm going to send this over to the simulator, because the simulator is going to show me what a standard 10-year monthly payment amount is as well. I do have to guess what the interest rate is in this case. I'll just say 6%. Right. In this scenario, let's say this person is going to start with $100,000 of income, right? And then we have to make some assumptions about what that income is going to do over time, right? Ideally, your income is going to increase. Now, all of that stuff I was talking to you about earlier, right? I've got that tax return on file, right? Maybe it's going to generate a $0 payment for me. And then my second year, I file my tax return. It's going to be half of what my income is because I'm starting work halfway through this tax filing season. Right, we've got a brand new feature in here. This just came out. This is a few weeks old. All I got to do is hit a button, right, and it adjusts that for me, right? If I've got that tax return from 2020 on file, I know my payment is going to be 0. My income documentation is 0 for that first year, which is now, right? And then when I file my tax return in 2021, which will happen in 2022, I know that income is going to be about half of what that annualized number is, right? So we'll do that for you. All you do is hit the button, right? So I'm going to assume at this point that they're not married, but this is where you would enter that information, right? So yes, no, or not yet. If that's coming up for you, you can add your dependents or children you're planning to have in the future. Some advanced simulation settings here. You can leave those at the default for now, and we can talk about those later. But this is where I can start to do some comparison here. So a standard 10-year monthly payment amount is about $3,800 per month, right? That's a lot, right? In this case, right? So if I just presume the person who asked that, do I have to consolidate my loans? Now this person technically doesn't have to consolidate their loans, right? But on November 1st or December 1st, the Department of Education is going to send them a bill for $3,800, right? That's going to be pretty shocking. And then to start the income-driven application at that point, they're probably going to put your loans into deferment because you're going to say, well, I can't make that payment, which means they're going to take the interest that accrues for that month and add it to the principal. Right? So there's a lot of side effects to waiting that you don't want to experience. Right? So get this started on your terms, and you can have a $0 monthly payment. Right? So you can have a minimum monthly payment of 0. Now, if you choose to pay more than that, that's up to you. I wouldn't recommend it, right? But at least the minimum is 0. Right? So I know I'm not in some weird position to know if I can even navigate that monthly payment. But I can start here to compare what are the costs. right? If I start working my way down under a plan like pay as you earn, I can see that, well, I'm not going to cover the interest. I actually rack up nearly $200,000 of additional interest. So I have an amount forgiven that's $189,000 higher than what I started with. If I assume some tax rate on that, this is what I need to pay the IRS to complete my student loan payment. But if I do so, right, that's less expensive than trying to pay it back faster, right? And we typically see this with higher debt balances or higher debt to income ratios, right? In this case, the debt to income ratio is about 3.4, right? So as you get closer to debt to income ratios above 2, you're going to see this play out. You're going to see an income driven repayment total cost be less expensive than even trying to pay it back faster, right? While freeing up all of that cash flow. Now you do have to figure out how I'm going to navigate this tax, right? And we have a forgiveness planning module for that, right? So 20 years, I've got 20 years to plan. I need $159,000. I have to save $486 per month and try to earn some return on that. In this case, we just assume a 3%, right? That's just to kind of nudge you to put that into something other than just a savings account, right? But if I do that, it'll cost me $116,000 to have that $159,000, which reduces my total cost even further, right? So in this case, we're nearly $120,000 less by paying what our income requires and planning for the forgiveness versus trying to pay it back faster, right? And that's what the simulator is really meant to help illustrate. Now back to the original question, right? How much income do I have to generate a $3,800 a month payment? Now, if I come down here into some of the additional graphs on the repayment simulator, I can see what those monthly payments are, right? And it never even gets close to $3,800 per month. And at this point in the simulation, if I come back up here to my income inputs, right, I've got a $228,000 income, right? And I'm still nowhere near that $3,800 a month payment. Right, so the question is always like, oh, well, what happens if I earn too much money and I get kicked out of pay as you earn, which actually can't happen, right? But how much, what is that number, right? What do you think that number is in this case, right? I mean, you can actually put this in the simulator, but it's going to be probably somewhere near $500,000 a year before you get to a taxable income number that's going to generate a monthly payment. Yeah, so in this case, it did it. So it's probably a little bit too much. So I'll back off on that. It's a little bit of an iteration. Let's try 450. So yeah, it's somewhere between, because here we can see we generated a monthly payment that's slightly less than the standard 10-year, right? But close. So it's somewhere between $450,000 and $500,000 per year, right? So this person who's got a $342,000 starting balance, when they would think about paying more towards their student loans is when their income gets to that level that generates something that's close to a standard 10-year plan payment. Now, the flip side of that, the corollary to that is if I had, a lower student debt balance, right? Again, and this is all driven based on a debt to income ratio, right? So let's say that I had $115,000 of student loans and my starting income is $120,000, right? I'm still going to reduce that because maybe I want to use a plan like Repay to jumpstart my financial wellness. This is where we're going to start to see, with a lower starting balance, a standard 10-year monthly payment plan is lower, right? Which means this income is going to come closer to generating a payment that looks like that sooner, right? And we can come down to the graph here, right? And see when it gets up, my income gets up. I'm starting to get closer to what that standard 10-year monthly plan payment is, right? So that's where income-driven repayment starts to parallel a standard 10-year, is when your debt starts to equal your income or your income exceeds your debt balance, right? That's when you want to think about paying more, not until then, right? And for many of you, that may not happen, or if it does happen, it's not going to be for a pretty significant time after graduation, right? So don't try to pay your loans like you're making $500,000 a year until you actually are making $500,000 a year. right? That's really the lesson here.
A couple questions here, Tony, as you keep moving
Mhm.
on. A lot of people are asking, where can they see if they're, well, one is, sorry, give me a second. We have a lot of questions. One is, where can, unfortunately, the upvote settings were not working correctly. So,
Oh, okay. Sorry.
so it's just causing a little more chaos than we normally have. But it's okay. It's 2021. Why not?
Yeah.
So a lot of people are asking, where can they see HPSL is in the grace period?
That's going to be with that loan servicer. So it's either going to be with your school account and your school financial aid account because the school is servicing the loan at that point, or if the school has moved it to that new loan servicer, that's who's going to reflect the status of that loan. Right? That's the only place I know that you can see your loan status is through that particular loan servicer. So it's either going to be with your school in that financial aid account or with the servicer that the school transferred that loan to.
Okay. Another question is for PSLF. Oh gosh, where did those go? Do residency years at an academic institution count towards PSLF?
Maybe. Right? So that's a question that you're going to have to get answered by that particular institution.
Yep.
Right? So I would recommend taking the public service loan forgiveness employment certification form. Right? So I believe there was a link to that on the public service loan forgiveness slide, which you guys will all have access to these after we're done here. But if you just type in PSLF employment certification form, you can see I've done that a few times. Right? This is the form. Right? You print this out and you take it to the residency program coordinator that you're considering, and you say, have you seen this before? Right? And they're going to either have residents that they're actually signing this, because there's a part on here that you fill out and there's a part on there that the employer fills out. Right? So they're either already doing this at that residency program, in which case you're golden, right? Or they've never seen it before, or they flat out say no, right? And if that's the case, then maybe that residency gets bumped down on your list of ones that you want to pursue. Right now, it's not automatic. Right now, I think it could be, but some of the schools can be sticklers about whether or not they're willing to consider you an employee. Right, a lot of it has to do with how they classify you during that residency program, and whether they're willing to check a box on here that says that they consider you to be an employee. And sometimes that gets into some weirdness within the bowels of the university system. Right? But some residencies I have worked with some residents and now specialists who have had their residency years qualified towards public service loan forgiveness. And I've seen ones that unfortunately couldn't get their residency program to get those years to qualify. Right? So you're going to have to explore that one on your own, but start with this form and bring it to that residency coordinator and see if they've seen it before. And ask them if they're willing to work with you. Right? Again, it really just has to do with whether or not they're willing to consider you an employee, right? So just because they haven't done it before doesn't mean they won't. And maybe you can blaze a new path, right? But you're gonna have to find that out directly with that program.
Is there any drawback to, for instance, if you originally choose repayee and switch to payee? Is there an issue with that? Or if you change plans multiple times, is there any sort of penalty for that?
Yes. So plan switching is another one of those triggers for interest capitalization, right? So when we were talking before about if you're making payments or let's say you're taking advantage of this ability to pay nothing during the first 12 months and have a low payment during the second 12 months, you're probably going to have some unpaid interest, right? Now, if you switch plans, they're going to take that unpaid interest and add it to your principal. Now, that isn't always a deal breaker, right? There are very specific instances where I'll use this, I'll use a residency as an example. Let's say you're kind of in a debt to income ratio between 1 and 2, but if you complete your specialization and become a board certified whatever, that your income is going to, at that moment, going to put you at a debt to income ratio less than 1. Right? In that case, if you're feeling pretty confident that that's going to happen for you, then start with repay, right? Because then you can get the unpaid interest subsidy. The government will cover the interest during your advanced education years, right? So it'll reduce the amount that you ultimately end up paying in total. However, let's say something happens, you do an internship. Let's say you're pursuing surgery, which requires another internship. And after that second internship, you don't get that residency, right? And you're like, oh, I'm done with this. I'm pulling the plug and I'm going to go into private practice, right? At that point, depending on what your income is, if it's still, your debt to income ratio is still greater than 1, you may consider switching from repay to pay that one time, right? But keep the plan switching to a minimum, right? You don't want to go switching from one plan to another, and there's really no reason to do so other than in that very specific case that I laid out there, right? Otherwise, I would stick to the plan that's the most flexible for you and stick with that repayment strategy, right? Even if your debt to income ratio ends up being way less than 1 at some point, you can still continue using income-driven repayment. You don't have to switch. Your payment will go up and you'll pay your loans to zero soon thereafter, right? You don't have to switch, right? You can still continue to pay your loans to zero using an income-driven repayment strategy, right? So, but there are very rare instances where switching can make sense, but keep the switching to a minimum.
Okay. Your debt to income ratio is based off income after tax or before tax?
So calculated a few different ways, right? Back of the napkin first. Take your total student debt balance divided by your annual gross income to start. What's that number? Right now, more realistically, because of how and what we've covered tonight and how income-driven repayment requires you to document your income, you could use your debt divided by your adjusted gross income. Right? That's the number that, again, that's kind of the gold standard that is used for income-driven repayment. Right? But that's going to, you could use that as well. Now, when you're married, the next question that usually comes up is, do I consider my spouse's income in that calculation? I would calculate it first with just your income, right? And then calculate with your spouse's income. But then I still would probably make my decisions based on my debt to income ratio, not my combined income ratio, right? Unless you both have debt too, right? Then that changes the game a little bit.
Okay, just a couple more here before we keep going. Is it possible to end grace period early by making a payment, correct? Oh, wait, sorry.
No.
It is possible to end grace period early by making a payment, even if it's a very small payment?
It is not. So again, that's another reason why that grace period is useless, right? I mean, you can choose to make payments during your grace period. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that. There's no penalties associated with that, but those payments are going to go towards the interest that is accrued during school. And that's generally not that helpful, right? Particularly if you're going to hit forgiveness, I would highly recommend against that, right? But just making a payment during the grace period does not count towards anything, right? Because you're not officially in an income-driven repayment plan, right? You need to get into an income-driven repayment plan for it to count towards something, right? And the only way to do that during your grace period is to end it through the consolidation process. The only way to end the consolidation is through end the grace period is through a direct consolidation loan, right? So yeah, I mean, there's so many reasons for ending that grace period with a consolidation than there are reasons not to do so.
A couple more. I do have a question regarding consolidation. If we do consolidate, are we forfeiting the eligibility to have loans potentially forgiven either partially or in full, depending on the current presidency?
No, not at all. Right. Again, so if you, and I encourage you to do this, you can do that through studentaid.gov. So another thing that's in here, if you want to do some light reading this weekend, right, is read your master promissory note. Right. The master promissory note for graduate professional students, all the loans that you borrow for veterinary school, it's the same for everybody. Right. And the laws are all written for these direct loans. Right. And if you consolidate your loans, you're taking, in most cases, direct loans, for some of you also including health profession student loans, but you're creating a new direct loan, which is still falls under the laws and regulations of this direct loan master promissory note, right, which has all of these provisions laid out: the income-driven repayment, forgiveness, public service loan forgiveness, right? Those are laws, right? These are not going to be, subject to change by future administrations. Now, they could change for people who haven't started school yet, they might come up with a new program that's called something else, right? Not direct loans, but, you know, super duper spectacular loans. And those super duper spectacular loans will have a different master promissory note, which may have different provisions, which might not include forgiveness, right? But that's not anything you have to worry about, right? Because you all have direct loans that are all governed by this master promissory note that says all of these things that we've been talking about today. Hopefully that, yeah, I mean, I get it, it's scary, and it sounds like those things can be subject to change. The only things that actually have changed recently is they've actually, at every instance, they have made these programs more beneficial rather than less, right? So the addition of, or how income-based repayment changed from IBR 2009 to 2014, the addition of pay-as-you-earn and revised pay-as-you-earn, which were better than the old version of IBR. I mean, all of these things have actually improved the student loan situation from the borrower standpoint. Now, recently, as part of a legislative package that was passed just a couple months ago, they've actually exempted student loan forgiveness from taxability if it happens between 2021 and 2025, right? Now, that's not really going to apply to nearly anybody, but it does open the door to the possibility that forgiveness could be non-taxable in the future, right? But you can't plan for that, right? So, you know, again, at every turn, I know everybody wants to feel the worst when it comes to your student loans, but at every turn, they have made these plans more beneficial rather than less. So I think that's a pretty good indication of what's likely to happen going forward.
Okay, just a couple more here. One, can you get kicked off the payee plan?
You cannot get kicked out. If you enroll in pay-as-you-earn as a new graduate, there is no scenario where you can get kicked out, right? The only way you can is kicked out is even the wrong terminology. The only way that you would start in pay and then find yourself in another plan is if you choose another plan, right? Once you're in an income-driven plan, you're always in it unless you choose a different one, right? Now, your payment can be different based on what your income shows, right? But I think the confusion with pay as you earn is that there's a partial financial hardship test, right? But that test is actually beneficial, right? It says that as long as your income generates a payment that is lower than what the standard 10-year plan payment is, then we're going to make your payment this instead of this, right? But if you all of a sudden get to a point where your income generates a payment that's higher than this under a plan like pay as you earn, then they're going to set the payment to this one, right? Which is in your favor. Right now, some people will say that well, I got kicked out of pay as you earn. You didn't get kicked out. You're still in pay as you earn. It's just your payment was set to the standard 10-year amount because your income justified it. Right. And I think, again, it's, you know, it's just this knee-jerk reaction to think that everything related to student loans is supposed to be punitive, and it's not, right? All of these income-driven plans are written in such a way that they're almost, in some instances, too beneficial, right? And now, when I say too beneficial, it means you're going to have a ton forgiven in certain cases, which makes the cost come down, but you still have to navigate what that tax is going to be, right? But in that instance of being kicked out or not, you know, when your income gets to a point where the payment generated under pay as you earn is actually higher than the standard 10-year plan payment, congratulations, right? That means you're now earning enough where the standard 10-year plan payment is 10% or less of your discretionary income. That's a good position to be in.
Okay, two more questions for you.
Yep.
Go forward. One, if you have a spouse graduating after, do you consolidate your loans together or consolidate them separately?
Oh, God, no. So, yeah, you're not even allowed to do that anymore. So way back in the day, they used to let spouses consolidate their loans together. And that is a holy heck of a mess. And there's still people that are affected by that. So they don't allow that anymore, right? And I would never encourage you to do that. The only way that you could do that now is if you did some kind of private consolidation with a private lender that was willing to take both of your loans and put them into the same loan. And I would never recommend that. So don't do that.
Okay. Can you consolidate loans that are in forbearance, not grace period?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, forbearance. The only status that doesn't allow you to consolidate your loans is when you're in school or in bankruptcy. So.
And then can I consolidate a loan that's listed as deferred when all others are in the grace period?
Yes, absolutely. So that's probably that Grad Plus loan, right? So those Grad Plus loans are always in deferment, right? They're really, I mean, they have a, what they call after graduation, they have a post-graduation 6-month deferment period, which is identical to the grace period of your direct unsubsidized loan. But the technicality there is it's in deferment, which means it can always be consolidated.
Is it beneficial to take loan payments from the CARES Act that your employer is offering?
Ooh, great question.
I knew you'd like that one.
Well, so you can do some analysis on that. Now, you may not actually have a choice there, right? For many of the employer programs that I have seen, it's either take it or take it, right? In certain instances, it isn't going to benefit you all that much, but you can add those here, right? So, for instance, we can do a thought experiment now. Let's say you're starting your job next week, right? And your employer payments towards your student loans start when you get your first paycheck, 2 weeks after that, right? We're still in the pandemic forbearance period, right? Let's say that you've consolidated your loans and put them in the pay as you earn, and your debt to income ratio is greater than 1, and you anticipate hitting forgiveness, right? It doesn't make sense for you nor your employer to make payments towards those loans, right? As we talked about earlier, it makes more sense to pay the minimum and plan for the forgiveness. So in that case, I would go back to that employer and say, hey, are you willing to provide that to me in my salary, or maybe a 401k, or towards my health insurance, or an HSA, something else is going to help with my overall personal financial wellness. Now, if your debt to income ratio is less than 1, then it can help, right? Because you're going to pay the loan to zero before zero. You're going to pay the loan balance to 0 before you hit forgiveness. So any payment that's made along the way is going to just decrease that time it takes to get to 0, right? But that's not the overwhelming majority of cases for recent graduate veterinarians, right? So unless you're in that debt to income ratio less than 1, even though those employer payments are now tax beneficial, they're not necessarily financially beneficial to you. So that's a can of worms, right? And if you want to explore that more specifically for your circumstance, that would be a great one to post on the VIN student debt folder, so we can kind of go through the numbers and give you some ammunition there in terms of the cost benefit analysis.
Somebody asked, what happens if we submitted a consolidation form without being in grace period?
Without it being
in a grace period.
Yeah, so that's exactly what happened to somebody who just posted on the student debt folder this week, where she started the consolidation process before her direct unsubsidized loans were in the grace period. Her Grad Plus loans ended up getting consolidated, but the unsubsidized ones did not, and she did not notice, right? And she missed the window where she could add them, right? So you have 180 days from the time that you start a consolidation to add eligible loans to that same consolidation, right? Now that's a great option that exists, but it also requires you to be pretty savvy about setting up some calendar reminders and making sure that that happens, right? It's more likely that you're going to get busy being a veterinarian, and the same thing that the person who posted had happened to them. And she can either choose now to consolidate those loans that didn't consolidate, which means they're going to be on a different clock than her Grad Plus loans, right? Because consolidation starts the clock over, right? So she puts everything into the consolidation, then she's going to lose the year the direct Grad Plus loans that were already in pay as you earn, right? Or she can just, the real kicker with hers is that she chose Fed loan servicing, right, to try to get her loans away from Navient, but only that half that was eligible for consolidation went to Fed loan servicing, and the other half is still with Navient. So now she's got 2 different loan servicers. One's a consolidated loan, the other ones are not consolidated. They're already on different forgiveness locks. right? So it's a little bit of a mess to fix. Now we can fix it, right? We can help her fix it, but it would have been a lot better if it was taken care of where you guys are sitting now, right? So wait for that direct unsubsidized loan to get in the grace period. If you have health profession student loans, wait for those to get in the grace period. Start the consolidation, end the grace period, follow it through. Make sure that all of those loans get included in that consolidation and that it's actually reflected to be in repayment that 30 days after it completes, right? And you're good to go, right? So all of these other permutations where it's like, oh, do I really have to consolidate? Or what if I don't? Or I just want to consolidate this one and not that one? I mean, whoa, there's so many potentials there for it to just go wrong, right? And I'm just trying to help you guys reduce those possibilities so you're not kind of painted into a corner where your options are less beneficial later.
Okay, let's let you get through some more before we hit you with more questions.
Sure, I think we've already kind of covered the debt to income ratio, I mean the private loan refinance, but these were some questions that people submitted that I kind of find interesting, right? But again, they all kind of follow the same recommendation, right? Whether your student debt is 150,000, right? Which I know people kind of get hung up on, well, I'm kind of in the gray zone. And I mean, if you see a really strong pathway for your income to exceed your debt within a couple of years after graduation, right? Then, then start out with repay and see if you can make a run for paying the balance to zero before forgiveness. But again, unless you're pretty confident that debt to income ratio is going to be less than 1, within a couple of years after graduation or after your advanced training, in the case of a specialist and specialty training, then, I don't really see a good reason for you not to start with pay as you earn. So the private loan refinance, again, I wouldn't even consider it until my debt to income ratio is less than 1, and I'm reasonably confident that it's going to stay that way for the duration of repayment, right? Because they're just not as flexible, right? I mean, you have an amazing insurance provision built into your federal student loans. Don't give that up lightly. Let's come back over to the simulator, and I want to actually bring this person's simulation over again. The higher debt one. So I'm going to do my $100,000 income. I'm going to make sure that I reduce that first year and second year's income. I'm going to run that simulation. But when you get tempted by those private loan refinance rates, use the simulator, particularly come down, see if you have something forgiven. When you do have something forgiven, you're going to want to pay special attention to this effective interest rate, right? Because when you take, in this instance, this person borrowed $320,000, right? And after 20 years, paid back $338,000, right? So she essentially paid $18,000 of interest on $320,000 balance over a 20-year period. Annualized over a 20-year repayment period, that comes out to an effective annualized interest rate of 0.3%, right? Even though her stated interest rate is 6%. Right? This is the kind of distortion that these income-driven plans can have. Right? Now, this is very prominent when your starting debt-to-income ratio is higher. Right? In this case, again, we're at 3.4. But when you get above 2, you will see this effective interest rate be less than the standard 10-year, and usually in the low 3% range, which is better than you can get on a private loan refinance, while having all of that nice insurance that if I lose my job or I move or I have a family and I go on maternity leave and I don't go back to work right away, or I'm trying to navigate this specialty pathway and it doesn't go as planned, right? I always can fall back on a very low to no payment and still be current on my student loans. Right? Your private loans are not going to let you do that. I see people that actually can't pursue specialty training because their private loans won't even let them defer, right? And they have to make a payment that's too high that their residency income won't support, right? So again, this student loan repayment stuff goes way beyond interest rates. And in a lot of cases, depending on the specifics of your simulation, you're going to see that this effective interest rate, what you end up paying in interest, is lower than what your parents would even give you for a loan, right? So this is what I'm talking about when I say these things are too beneficial in certain instances. And it's kind of tongue in cheek, but you do have to figure out a way to navigate this tax, right? Making sure that you're going to have enough on hand in case the IRS collects that tax on student loan forgiveness. Okay, so this one I need everybody to pay close attention to. So back to deferment. And notwithstanding this very, very special pandemic forbearance period that we're all living through, don't ever use deferment and forbearance again, right? There's never, I can't even come up with a good reason to use deferment or forbearance ever again on your federal student loans, right? The income-driven plans are too beneficial, right? So what happens when you put your loans in deferment or a non-pandemic forbearance? Just like when you went through school, right? That interest that you accrued during school gets added to your principal when that deferment period ends, right? The same thing will happen if you put your loans in a deferment during an internship, second internship, 3 years of a residency. As soon as you come out of that training and that deferment period ends, that interest gets added to your principal. And whether or not you're going to pay your balance to zero or hit forgiveness at that point, you're still going to pay more than you have to, right? So instead, keep your loans in an income-driven repayment plan, right? You can have a payment as low as zero when your loans are still considered to be in good standing. The only difference here is you'll still accrue interest while your payment's low. But the difference here is as your income increases, the unpaid interest doesn't get added to the principal, right? There's no capitalization just because your income increases, right? So there's never a good reason to use deferment and forbearance. For those of you that are heading into internships now, talk about that with your other intern colleagues. If there's residents there too, talk about that with the residents, because I can guarantee you the lion's share of those interns and residents that you're going to be working with have their loans in deferment, right? Help them end that deferment and get their loans into repayment. If you're going to go back and do an academic residency, MPH, PhD, beware of the automatic student loan deferment. So just like when you all went into veterinary school, if you had loans from undergrad, those loans get automatically deferred. Or the loans that you borrowed for first year get automatically deferred so you don't have to pay them when you get to second year, right? Being in school at least half time automatically defers your loans. That's kind of built into the system. Now you can waive that automatic deferment, but you have to do it ahead of time. You have to reach out to your loan servicer and say, hey, I'm back in school as part of this residency program. If you guys get some kind of deferment trigger from my school, I want you to ignore it and keep my loans in repayment, right? You have to do that ahead of time. Otherwise, your loans will get automatically put in deferment, right? This happened to my wife when she was doing her residency. We got bit by it one time and then never again, right? So as soon as she started her residency, she had a master's of clinical science associated with that. Her loans got kicked out of IBR and put into deferment, which means the interest that she accrued to that point got then capitalized when we ended that deferment, right? There's no way to undo that. So other than contacting them ahead of time and telling them you want to keep your loans in repayment, particularly if this is going to qualify for public service loan forgiveness, right? You want that time to qualify. Deferment time does not qualify for public service loan forgiveness, right? Repayment time does, deferment time does not. Okay, financial wellness. Jumpstart your financial wellness plan. Do you have a 2020 tax return on file? What's your 2021 tax return going to look like, right? Kind of think about these things, right? That's going to keep your payments low. That's also going to free up cash flow for you to build an emergency fund, right? Something like 30% of you told me that you don't have an emergency fund yet. That's fine. I'm willing to let that go because you just graduated from school, but fix that, right? Emergencies happen, right? That's the definition, right? You can't predict them, but you want to have some cash on hand so you don't have to put those unexpected expenses on a credit card, right? Because that takes a long time to get out from underneath. So have an emergency fund, right? That emergency fund is way more important than paying more than you can afford towards your student loans. Credit card debt. I was shocked at how many of you told me that you have credit card debt that you don't pay off in full each month. It was close to 30%. of you who submitted those student debt to income signalment forms, right? Pay that stuff off first. I know that the student loan balance is higher, but that credit card debt is way more painful, right? So work on a plan, a budget, free up the cash flow from your student loans and get rid of that credit card debt. Build the emergency fund so you never have to carry a credit card balance again, right? If you can't pay the credit card balance in full with your income each month, then don't use the credit card, right? I know a lot of people, they tell me they're trying to build credit, blah, blah, blah. Carrying a credit card balance just makes the banks rich, right? So you can build your credit without paying interest to the credit card companies. Build your retirement savings. The earlier you can start, the better, please, right? I mean, you can't go back in time, right? And time is a huge component of retirement savings, right? It's probably one of my biggest financial regrets from vet school is that I wasn't continuing to build my retirement savings that I had from a prior career during veterinary school, right? Even during veterinary school, right? You can't afford to wait to start your retirement savings, right? The time component is one of the most important factors there. You'll never be able to catch up if you lose a significant amount of time, right? So you have to start that as early as you possibly can. Target 10% of your gross income. Even if you're in an internship, I would encourage you to try to start saving for retirement. If you have access to a health savings account as part of your employment or as part of your health insurance that you're paying, that you have to max these out too. You may feel bulletproof health-wise, but at some point we all need a doctor, right? And those health savings accounts kind of work like a retirement plan for your health expenses. So even though you don't need them now, you can let them grow over time, and they're tax deductible on the way in and tax deductible on the way out. You never get taxed on those dollars, right? So health savings accounts are outstanding places to put your money, right? Even if you don't have any health expenses to deal with now. Saving for down payment on a home or practice is where I'll bring up what Jordan brought up, right? So people always are telling me, and you can find a million sob stories in the news that I can't afford to buy a home because of my student loans. That's just not true, right? Depending on how you choose to pay down your student loans will definitely prevent you from buying a home. But if you take a smart approach to this, you can actually buy a home sooner rather than later, right? So if I'm not making any payments towards my loans during the first 12 months, and I'm actively working on my emergency fund and my retirement savings and working on a down payment on a home, I can get to that home purchase sooner than if I tell myself, well, I need to finish paying my loans down first, right? And when I went to buy our home here in Denver, I was all prepared for the bank to say, oh, well, you guys have way too much student debt, or your payment towards your student loans is way too low. There's no way we're going to give you any financing. I was pretty much ready to give them this presentation, right? And our student loans never even came up, right? And we have more than $400,000 in student loans, right? We were using an income-driven plan. Our payment was a manageable percentage of our income. That minimum monthly payment showed up on our credit report, and the bank never even asked us about our student loans, right? And we got a killer interest rate on our home, right? So you don't have to worry about your student loans preventing you from getting financing for something like a home. Same applies with practice, right? People think that, oh, I can't buy a practice, I got student debt. Absolutely not, right? But you're going to need some cash probably to be a realistic candidate if you need to finance that practice purchase. So don't pay that cash toward your student loans. Prepare yourself for that practice ownership opportunity if that's on your career goals. If you're going to use an income-driven plan, run simulations, look and see if you're going to have something forgiven, and start planning. Again, just like retirement, the earlier you start, the better you're going to be. Like I started this whole thing off with tonight. My wife and I are using income-driven repayment. We're planning, anticipating having to pay a tax to the IRS. We're 70% to our target, right? And we've got a lot of time to adjust, right? And that's what we're shooting for, right? I don't want to be cutting it razor thin the year that I'm anticipating paying that tax. I want to have enough on hand and then just spend the last several years adjusting it, tweaking it up or down if I need to in order to accommodate any changes or anticipated increases or decreases in tax rates, things like that. So run your simulations. We do in the loan repayment simulator, there's another thing we just added, right? So I've got a pretty good, everybody's always like, well, how do I start saving for forgiveness, right? Well, we've got some recommendations here for that, right? So how do you plan for the tax, right? We go into detail here about how it's anticipated to be treated. Everybody wants to call it the tax bomb. You know, worst case scenario, currently the highest marginal federal income tax rate is 37%. That means you get a 63% discount on what's remaining on your student loans, right? That's a pretty big discount, right? And that's a worst case scenario. So, I mean, the discount is probably going to be more than that, right? So everybody likes to call it the tax bomb, which I think unfortunately scares people away. But in reality, it's going to be a huge discount in terms of, and that's what makes those costs look a lot lower in a lot of the scenarios that we run, even accounting for the forgiveness. But the concepts to forgiveness planning are very similar to retirement planning, right? You got a long time horizon, 20, 25 years. You want to, have some diversified investments, so you're not putting it all in one place essentially. But the one difference there is that when you have to pay the IRS, it's going to be due on April 15th of that tax year, right? So it's not the same as retirement where I might choose to work a little bit longer or adjust my, my quality of life if I don't have as much on hand when I retire. The same thing doesn't apply to your forgiveness savings, right? The IRS is going to want that amount. You're going to have to pay it by that tax filing year, come hell or high water, right? So there's no opportunity for you to just call the IRS and say, well, this isn't really a good year for this to happen. Can we do this next year? No, there's not, right? I mean, you're going to have to pay the taxes. Otherwise, you're going to incur a whole bunch of penalties and fees and more things, and your student loans are going to drag on even longer, right? So use that time to prepare for that forgiveness plan, right? And we're going to give you some assistance here where you can change this tax rate to whatever you think is reasonable, whatever you think you're going to do with that forgiveness savings plan and how much you think you're going to earn percent return wise. As you're working towards it, this is another recent feature we just added. You can include how much you've already gotten saved towards forgiveness, and we'll adjust your monthly payment based on how much you have already saved towards that forgiveness. So you can tell if you're on track or not. Right? So again, we've got the tools to help you do this. Use them. Use the student debt message board folder so you can ask questions about what you don't understand. Here again, effective interest rate below 2% in this case. This person had a starting repayment balance that was closer to $240,000, right? So again, you'll see as you're running your simulations where you fall out here. But if you consistently see an amount forgiven, pay the minimum, plan for the forgiveness, right? That's going to save you the most money and it's going to free up the most cash flow. You want some help in terms of how do I invest or save for the forgiveness? Look for a certified financial planner. Ideally, look for a fiduciary. Ask them, right, if they adhere to the fiduciary standard. That means that they make their money based on the time that they spend with you or the amount of the assets they're managing for you, rather than selling you something that they get a commission from, right? So ask them how they're paid if they're a fiduciary planner. Here are some resources that generally are fiduciary planners. National Association of Personal Financial Advisors or the CFPs have this Let's Make a Plan, right? So that essentially this allows you to put your zip code in and look for those financial planners that are in your area. Now, I do have a word of caution there. They don't get a lot of training on income-driven repayment, right? So you don't necessarily want to vomit your student loan situation on their desk. But if you get to a point where you're like, oh, well, I think I need about $80,000 20 years from now, and I need some help to get there, that's what they're really good at, right? If you go to them with that detail and say, hey, I'm using this plan through the Department of Education that is probably going to have me paying a tax of $80,000 20 years from now, can you help me craft a series of investments to help me get there? That's what the financial planners are really good at. Right? I'd love it if they could, start including on the CFP exam some income-driven repayment knowledge, but I haven't seen that to be the case yet. So you have to be a little bit careful. I find that a lot of them aren't very up to speed on a lot of the idiosyncrasies of the student loan repayment differences, which is why we build the tools we have. So you can be familiar with those, but then you can use the planners for the things that they're very good at, right? Which is planning. Enjoy life, right? You didn't go to school just so you can pay off your student loans, right? You went to school to become a veterinarian and pursue all the dreams and goals associated with that, right? And all the things that you want to do outside of that. right? For me, it's fly fishing. Anybody know what this red one is? I included this one. I found this is one of my favorite pictures. Yeah. Oh, Dr. Moffat, cheater. Oh, I see him hanging around there. Yeah,
it's sort of cheating, but
yeah,
no.
that's a no, he's a fly fishing junkie too. So, but yeah, correct. It's a kokanee salmon. So these are landlocked sockeyes that we have here in Colorado, but they're interdispersed in the inner Mountain West. But I caught this in the Gunnison River in the fall, which is just one of the coolest places you can be at that time of year. And then this other one is a rainbow in the Wind River Canyon, and this was just about a month ago, so it was still snow in there. But there's some really, really, really big rainbows in Wyoming. Thank you, Dr. Moffat. All right. So does anybody else have any additional questions?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Shoot.
Okay, let's just start going through them. Hello, I have a mandatory loan repayment counseling session hosted by my veterinary college. Before this, they said that it is best to pay off the interest of your loans with the lowest principal first so that there is less interest added to your principal balance when you consolidate. However, I believe that you take the position of consolidating as soon as possible, even before the grace period is over. Can you please explain why your approach is better?
Certainly. So yeah, I believe that recommendation that was made to you is based on a traditional repayment strategy, right? So in the case that you believe that your debt to income ratio is going to be 1 or less than 1 shortly after graduation, that can make sense, right? But again, looking at the macro sense of recent graduate veterinarians, that is not the predominant student loan case. Right now, it is a pretty common case for undergrads, which is a lot of the financial advice I see given to veterinarians, right? I mean, if the average undergrad debt is $30,000 and you're going to, make $60,000 a year, doing what that person recommended makes sense. But if you've got $200,000 of debt and your income is $100,000, then that doesn't make any financial sense, right? You don't have the cash flow now to pay off your unpaid interest before it capitalizes. And even if you did, it's quite likely that you're going to reach forgiveness, in which case you just paid more towards your student loans than you otherwise had to, right? So it doesn't make financial sense, particularly in the income-driven forgiveness scenarios, right? Now that does require a little bit of a crystal ball, right? So that's where those debt to income ratios come in really handy. If your debt to income ratio is greater than 1, then I wouldn't mess around with trying to pay your unpaid interest before it capitalizes and you went to repayment. If it's less than 1 and you have a really sound budget and you've already got an emergency fund, you don't have any credit card debt, you've already started saving towards retirement, right? You're working on your other financial goals and you've still got money to burn in your budget and you're staring at some unpaid interest before you enter repayment, then maybe I would do that, right? But there's just the average numbers show us that the overwhelming majority of veterinarians graduate veterinary school with a debt to income ratio greater than 1, in which case that recommendation doesn't make financial sense.
Okay, does their credit report also include HPSL?
Yes, but it's only on a specific one, and I forget the one right now. Samantha Chenoweth, who is an excellent financial advisor at UC Davis, goes through that information with the UC Davis students. But what that means is you just have to check all 3 credit reports. For some reason, those HPSLs only get reported to one of the credit agencies, and I don't know why. So check your report for all of them, right? And you should find it on there.
Okay, I've used the VIN debt, they call it the VIN debt calculator. We'll call it the VIN Foundation Student Loan Repayment Simulator. And the IBR 2014 and pay as you earn come out identical in amount to repay as well as monthly payments. Is there a benefit for one over the other? And I'm mentioning this question because a couple people have asked for differentiators between the two.
Yes, that's an excellent observation. The quick answer there is if you're eligible for IBR 2014 right now, so that goes back to this income-driven repayment plan eligibility tab. right? Now, this particular person didn't meet those requirements. Now, IBR 2014, the only people that are eligible for that, and a lot of you may be eligible for that, the only people that are eligible for that took their first federal student loan after July 1st, 2014, right? That means you're a new borrower for the purposes of income-based repayment, right? Which means that you're either eligible for this version of IBR or this version. It can't be both, right? Now this person's eligible for the old version. Now you may be eligible for the new version, but you can throw all of that out the window, right? Because pay as you earn is better than income-based 2014, right? Even though the costs in that simulation you ran are identical, right? That can happen because pay as you earn and IBR are almost identical, except there is one provision in pay as you earn that makes it better than the new version of IBR, and it has a additional layer of insurance that ends up being in your favor, right? And that insurance is if you fall out of partial financial hardship with pay as you earn, and we talked about that earlier, right? So if your income gets to a point where the payment using pay as you earn is actually higher than it would be under a standard 10-year plan, and you fall out of partial financial hardship, at that point, your unpaid interest can capitalize, but pay as you earn will cap the amount of interest that will get added to your principal balance at 10% of your starting balance. Right now, that gets way, way, way into the weeds, and almost nobody ever has to even worry about that. But that additional layer of insurance makes pay as you earn a better choice than the new version of IBR always. Right? And anybody that qualifies for IBR 2014 will also be eligible for pay as you earn. So pick pay as you earn.
Okay, I'm planning to practice in the UK after graduating. Does this affect my payment plan since I'll be earning a foreign income?
Yeah, that one always comes up. That's one of my favorites. Yeah, so yes, you will still be required to file a tax return as a US citizen in most cases. However, because you'll be living and working in the UK, there's some tax benefits associated with that in terms of being a US citizen, in that you're not going to have a very high, if any, taxable income, right? So your adjusted gross income on your US tax return could very well be zero for the entire time that you're living and working in the UK. Now that may sound great, right? You're not going to pay any taxes to the US and you wouldn't have to pay anything towards your student loans, but you will have quite a bit forgiven, right? And there's no escaping that. So it will reduce, and you can take advantage of the fact that you don't have much, if any, monthly payment due towards your student loans. But I would encourage you to run that through the simulator and see what that does to your forgiveness number and plan accordingly, right? Because you're probably going to have a pretty significant amount forgiven, right? Which means you're going to generate a tax that year when you file your tax return with the US, and you're still going to have to pay that tax under student loan forgiveness, provided that's in place.
Okay, if you do student loan, and this, we might not have the answer to this because I know that we've gotten a couple of these questions before. If you do student loan repayment through the military, example, reserves is 60,000 over 4 years, does that change how the income-driven repayment plans work?
Yeah, it does. You know, this, and we see the same thing happen with the Veterinary Medical Loan Repayment Program. Because those are payments that are made directly to your loans, right? So it was a slightly similar corollary that we talked about with the employer payments, right? If you're anticipating hitting forgiveness, you know, I wish there was some other way for them to give you that money, but in most cases there's not, right? The only way that they're allowed to give you those funds is as direct payments towards your loans. Now that doesn't mean you shouldn't do them, right? I mean, if your career is taking you into the military and you're eligible for those payments towards your student loans, then take it, right? I mean, you know, but if in a perfect world, they would give you the option of having that funds available some other way. But that's not the world we live in, right? So it'll reduce, I mean, it may reduce your student loans enough to the point where you pay them to zero before reaching forgiveness, but it may not, right? So, you know, it really just depends on the specifics of your circumstance. But generally speaking, if your debt to income ratio is such that you would be due to hit forgiveness, it financially just doesn't make sense to make additional payments towards your student loans unless those payments get high enough that they pay the balance in full before you hit forgiveness. But that can be pretty tough to do with a lot of veterinary sized education debt balances.
Does consolidating loans extend the repayment time past either 20 or 25 years?
No, it actually shortens it, right? So, well, depends, right? So again, you're not, the clock hasn't started for anybody here yet, right? Because the grace period doesn't count. But once you consolidate and the consolidation completes and you're in income-driven repayment, the clock starts, right? So it's 20 years under pay-as-you-earn from that point. Right? So the soonest you can reach forgiveness is the soonest you can get your loans consolidated and into income-driven repayment. Right? So that's what starts the clock. Right? If you don't consolidate, then the clock won't start until after your grace period ends, right? Which means the 20-year clock starts November, December if you graduated in April, May. Right? Now, if you consolidate later, right, which you can do, I mean, it comes up all the time, right? But again, you don't want to consolidate later, you want to consolidate now. But if you were to consolidate 5 years into repayment, right, because your loan servicer said that it would be a good idea for you because they say a lot of stupid things to a lot of people, right? And you listen to them and consolidate your loans, then you've just restarted the clock. Now, the other time this can come into play is if you've had loans from before veterinary school that you've paid using an income-driven repayment plan, right? So you've got some forgiveness time that's already logged on some previous loans, and you may want to leave those out of the consolidation, right? So you can keep that time that you've earned towards forgiveness. You may have a couple of different forgiveness events, right? But it'll result in a lower cost if you ultimately end up hitting forgiveness, right? But that starts to get really complicated. Most people that I talk about that with, they choose to consolidate all their loans anyway because they want them to be on the same clock, right? Now, for all those people that have been faced with that, they usually don't have more than a year or 2 years worth of qualifying forgiveness time on those prior loans. So to them, it wasn't worth it to keep that. But we're getting far enough down the road now where you could have 5 years or more of qualifying forgiveness time. It may be worth preserving that, right? And consolidation, again, because it issues a new loan, it erases all of the history of those previous loans, right? So it essentially starts the clock over.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just hope that, because that question is a little vague, right? So, I think I need a little more specifics in terms of what you're referring to specifically, or post that on the student debt message board folder, and we can go into it in detail there.
Yeah, and we will be sending out within the next couple of days from studentdebt@vinfoundation.org. You will be receiving a recording of this webinar, the presentation link, as well as a PDF checklist and links to all the things that we've mentioned and all those things on Tony's slide there. I recently applied for a repayment plan and was accepted. Can I still do the federal loan consolidation without penalty?
Yeah, well, yes, without penalty. However, right, you're going to have to reapply for that repayment plan, essentially, right? They're not going to, again, because when you can, right now, you have your loans that you applied for repayment in that repayment plan, right? And if you consolidate them, it's going to create a new loan that doesn't have any knowledge of that previous repayment plan, right? So you can consolidate them, but you're going to have to reapply for that repayment plan again.
OSLA versus federal loan.
Fed loan servicing, right? Again, I don't know anything about any of the lesser loan servicers. The only thing I do know is that Fed loan servicing is the official monitor of public service loan forgiveness. And just by default, because you have to use an income-driven plan to qualify for public service loan forgiveness, that makes them the most knowledgeable about income-driven repayment, right? So that's the only one that I can recommend. And even then, they're still not great, right? You have to still watch these folks like a hawk and know enough to keep yourself out of trouble.
Can my parents consolidate their parent plus loans and do IBR as well?
Ooh, great question. Yes, they can consolidate their parent plus loans. They actually have to, but the only income-driven plan that they're eligible to use is ICR, income contingent repayment, which is the first version of income-driven repayment and is not all that great. However, I have seen it be beneficial particularly for parents who are in retirement and living on fixed incomes, right? That ICR tends to work really well in those scenarios. But yes, unfortunately, Parent Plus loans aren't eligible for the more beneficial income driven plans. They're only eligible for ICR if they consolidate them. And they have to consolidate them in order to make them eligible for ICR. But sometimes if your parents are, still in their earning years, ICR probably isn't going to be all that beneficial because it tends to generate a pretty high payment.
If it takes 30 days to consolidate your loans, as long as I put in the application before I start, I qualify for the $0 monthly payment for 12 months. Is that correct?
That is correct. It's from the time when you're sitting down filling the application out, right? Do you have taxable income at that moment, right? If you haven't started your job yet and you haven't received any income from that employer indicating, signing bonus or whatever, then the answer to that question is I don't have any taxable income. Right? And they're not going to check in with you again. Now, if something happens with that, this is why it's nice to have the tax return on file, right? I mean, these all presume that these things go as planned, right? Sometimes they don't, right? Sometimes you submit an application and your loan servicer doesn't get around to processing it on time and they, say, oh, sorry, we lost that. We're going to have you start it again, right? And now if you're working, that question is a little bit harder to answer, right? Do you have taxable income? Well, now I'm working. I do, right? So now I got to send them my pay stub. Right. So it depends on what your income status is when you're filling out that application. But if you have that tax return on file, again, that's the bonus of having the tax return on file, right? Because you always can use that, and it's followed up by that question: has your income significantly decreased since you filed that tax return? Right. If I've got a tax return that says 0, you can't get any lower income, right? So you can always use that.
No. I was told by Fed Loan Servicing that to add HPSL onto this consolidation request, they said the form that I needed to fill out was the same regardless if it was during the consolidation request 10-day period or after. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I mean, that was where we went through in here in the consolidation process, right? There's that add loans button, right? So when you add, that's what they're saying, right? So the process is the same, right? If I've got these loans as an example that they find in my student aid data file, right? And I need to add my health professional student loans, I'm going to add them here, right? That process is the same regardless, right? Now, if you have to do it via paper, there's a paper version to do this too, right? But it's easier if you can do this all electronically.
Along those same lines, somebody had a question that said, okay, after applying for consolidation, do we need to print off the application, mail it in, or is the electronic application automatically sent and reviewed?
I don't know that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that you can electronically sign the application. Now, and maybe one of the Rising Leaders folks can tell us that if you did it electronically, because when I consolidated my loans, I could only do it manually, right? And there was a lot of signatures being passed back and forth and post mailing that went on.
That was a long time ago, though, Tony.
Yeah, right, exactly. So we have since come leaps and bounds there. So I don't know if Rebecca or Shiloh has any can remember the electronic consolidation process in terms of the signing and how that goes back and forth.
Yeah, Shiloh or Rebecca, do either of you?
Gosh, yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to remember. It seems like it doesn't matter if it was 1 year or many years ago. That's a little fuzzy.
Well, I do remember having to physically sign it and wait for it to come in the mail. I mean, did you guys have any of that stuff, or was it all done electronically?
I feel like it was, if I recall, it was all done electronically. I don't remember signing anything and printing it off and submitting it.
Okay.
Now,
Yeah, mine was all electronic.
I mean,
Yeah,
I can't imagine during COVID they're making you print and sign and
Who
lick
knows?
that envelope.
It is the Department of Education, so you never know, right? I mean, there's still, like, even when you file your taxes now, there's still forms that you can only send post mail. So, I mean,
We do have an attendee that said that she just consolidated and it was all electronic and she's
Okay.
waiting to hear
Great.
I do think that they do use COVID for reasoning for prolonged wait times for results. So it might be a while before you hear back, like a month or so.
Yeah, I would be really diligent though of making sure they have a good email for you on file and checking your spam folder, right? You don't want to kind of let this go, right? So open up, and if you've submitted that consolidation tonight, right, open up your calendar that you use and put a reminder in for 30 days from now to look for, some kind of electronic communication from the Department of Education and your new loan service, right? Because if you haven't received anything in that 30-day period, that's when I would start making phone calls. Right now, it may be that it's taking them a little longer than 30 days, but I'm still calling after 30 days to check in on the status.
Okay, if your direct loans say N/A under repayment plan instead of grace period, what does that mean? Just keep waiting. Do we need to do anything?
No, that just means that there probably isn't anything listed. So I would check again at the turn of the new month, right? So the student aid data files, unless there's reason for them to update the information in there, they tend to get updated every month, right? So I would wait maybe until June 1st to see if that has changed, and if it still is empty or isn't eligible to be consolidated, right? So you can try starting the consolidation process, and usually for the loans that aren't eligible to be consolidated, they either won't pull them in or they'll give you some kind of error message that that loan isn't able to be consolidated, right? So I still may try it to see if it's just not officially listed in the grace period and is blank, but it could still be eligible for consolidation.
Okay. If we check the box for PSLF when consolidating loans and end up not qualifying for PSLF later on, example, doing an academic internship residency, then private practice, will there be any consequences, or do you just fall back into income-based plan?
Yeah, great question. So no, there's no consequences to that, right? And you're always in an income plan, right? So because one of the requirements to qualify for public service loan forgiveness is to use an income-driven repayment plan, right? It's just whether or not you're meeting the other requirements, right? So after everything that we've talked about tonight, right, you guys are going to consolidate your loans into a direct consolidation loan. You're probably going to use an income-driven repayment plan. You're already meeting those first two of the three public service loan forgiveness requirements. The last one just depends on your employment status, right? If you're working for one of those eligible employers, well, now you're checking that last box, and then the payments you're making during that qualified employment will count towards public service loan forgiveness. If you're not working for a public service loan forgiveness eligible employer, you're just continuing on in income-driven repayment, right? That's the only difference.
Okay. How do we know if we're still eligible for the grace period? Had to repeat year one of vet school, and I have the understanding that I use my grace period waiting to restart school that next August.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you only get one grace period for each loan, right? And if you had loans from undergrad, or in that case, for the first year of vet school, and you were out of school for a long enough period of time for that grace period to be used up, then there's not another grace period for those loans. But thankfully, given this pandemic forbearance period you're in, it doesn't matter all that much, right? So normally those loans would go back into repayment rather quickly, right? Usually, 30 days after you graduate, those loans that have already used their grace period would go back into repayment automatically. Right now, you can apply to have them into an income-driven repayment plan, but probably a better move is to include them in your consolidation. And since you're doing that while it's in that pandemic forbearance period, you don't have to worry about those loans entering repayment before they get consolidated.
Okay, do we have to wait between completing IBR application and the consolidation application?
So again, as part of the consolidation is part of the process, right? So you start the consolidation application, and when you get to the point where you choose your income-driven repayment plan, that's where it then kind of switches from the consolidation application to the income-driven application, right? So submit the consolidation, it'll ask you which income-driven plan to use. Those things are kind of combined together, right? So start with the manage loans, consolidate my loans before you get to the apply for income-driven payment plan. You actually won't even have to use this if you start with this. You start with consolidate my loans first.
Okay, if I already submitted an application for pay as you earn to my loan servicer, can I go back and consolidate my loans and pick a new servicer?
Yes, you can, right? Because again, if you submit an application, and this is another one of those just bizarre features, if you want to call it that, of the loan repayment system. If you submit a pay-as-you-earn application during your grace period, they're going to ignore it, right? Because you can't apply for repayment during your grace period. And you can't apply for an income-driven repayment plan until you're 60 days or so away from repayment starting, right? So if you submit an application for income-driven repayment during your grace period, they're not gonna pay attention to it, right? So you can consolidate your loans now, then reapply or re-choose pay-as-you-earn as part of that consolidation application, and then they'll put your loans in pay-as-you-earn after your consolidation is complete.
Okay, I technically graduate on September 30th. So all my unsubsidized loans are still quote unquote in school. Do you recommend that we wait until after the October month passes before consolidating to avoid the chaos?
Say that one more time. What's the graduation date again?
September 30th.
September 30th. Oh.
Which is so tricky, right? That's like the last day.
Well, yeah, right. So, well, hopefully, right? Hopefully you'll have those loans that trigger their grace period like the day or two after graduation, and you can start the consolidation. But you know what? What's going to happen, which is what happens normally, is you're going to accrue a little bit of interest in that interim period, and you'll have a little bit added to your principal once that consolidation completes. There's just no way around it, right? That's actually the normal case, right? It just happens to be that you're graduating on the last day of this pandemic forbearance, which is, yeah, it's just all very bizarre.
Okay, just a couple more. We're almost through. If it says in school for our loans, direct, unsub, direct sub, and direct plus are the three types I have. And on the VIN simulator, after we upload the student data, we can't consolidate until they all switch to grace period. Is that correct?
That's not correct, right? So the only ones, again, the only ones that hold up the process, right? The only ones that get left out of the consolidations because they need to be in their grace period are the direct unsubsidized loans, the health profession student loans, and the loans for disadvantaged students. Right, all of the other loans, right, predominantly, and when I say that, all of the other loans, it's going to be your direct Red Plus loans, right? Those don't have to be in any different status, right? As soon as you graduate, they're already in deferment, right? So you can consolidate them immediately. They don't hold up the process. They can always be included in the consolidation. It's those direct unsubsidized loans that tend to be the problem, and then health profession student loans, loans for disadvantaged students, another problem, because those tend to take a little bit longer to enter their grace period. But sometimes you get lucky, right? So I have seen, and thankfully, a lot of the recent graduates this year, their loans, their direct unsubsidized loans, moved from that in-school status to the grace period days, single-digit days after they graduate.
Okay, if we're starting an academic internship in mid-June and would have loans go into deferment since we are classified as a student during the internship, how do we correct this and prevent the deferment since the consolidation process likely can't be started until June 1 and won't be finished until after the start date?
So great question, but I don't believe your internship is going to throw you into student status. Right, so check on that with your internship program. To my knowledge, internships are actually pretty cut and dry that you're actually more of an employee, right? You're not really taking classes, you're not enrolled in credit hours at the school that you're doing the academic institution internship with, right? You're an intern, right? You're underpaid labor. Right. So now the residency is different in that regard, usually because there's oftentimes formal classes that those residents are taking alongside their duties as underpaid labor, right? So usually, I haven't seen that. Now you can correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, and if you want to post that on the student debt folder and we can kind of dig deeper into your internship program, but I don't think I've ever seen an internship that also has you enrolled half-time as a student. And that's the requirement to automatically defer your loans. Right, so you should be able to avoid that automatic deferment with your internship if you consolidate your loans and enter income-driven payment.
Okay.
Now, if you tell your loan servicer that you're doing an internship, they'll be happy to defer your loans, but you don't want them to do that, right? So one of the things you guys have to be really careful of when you call your loan servicers is that they hand out deferments like candy, right? You do not want that to happen, right? Because that deferment, unfortunately, at the end of that deferment will end up in unpaid interest capitalization, right? And they love to defer your loans. So you have to kind of steer them away from that. No, I don't want them in deferment. I want them in income driven.
Okay. So for IBR 2014 is for loans taken after 2014. So if you have small loans prior to that, can you pay those off and then will you qualify, or is it overall loans taken out in your life?
Yeah, it's overall, right? So you wouldn't unless you paid those previous loans off before you started borrowing again after July 2014. And you know, in reality, it doesn't matter, right? You probably still qualify for pay as you earn, which means that's going to be a better choice anyway, right? So don't worry about whether or not you qualify for IBR 2014, right? As long as you qualify for pay as you earn, you're going to be in better shape anyway.
Okay. Is there a way to change the federal tax income if you filed jointly with your husband in 2020, or do you have to take the hit and then file separate for 2021?
That's an accountant question. You can refile, but I imagine since we're past the filing deadline now, there'll be some consequences to that. So a couple things there though. If you're both moving, right, and you both don't have any income during this move, then you can still check the box that says, yeah, married, we filed jointly, but we currently both don't have any income, right? So I have seen that work for some married folks in the past where, hey, we're kind of moving as a unit here, and my spouse had a job when I was at vet school, but now they don't because they're getting a new job where I'm moving to. That would still meet that check the box on we don't have any income, right? But if that's not the case, then you can use that joint tax return and your payment on your student loans will be based on that joint tax return, which is presumably your spouse's income.
Okay, the last is just a comment on one of the questions regarding the question, academic internship, student classification and deferment. He said they're classified as a non-degree seeking graduate student employed as a graduate teaching assistant.
Yeah, so I think that's so there you go. Like you're employed as a teaching assistant, right? You're, you know, to be, for the automatic deferment to be triggered, you have to be enrolled in school. You have to be earning credits, right? And you have to be earning enough credits that you meet the half-time threshold. I don't think I've ever seen an internship that makes interns take sufficient credit hours to meet the half-time student threshold.
Okay, 195 questions.
Wow.
And just under 3 hours, Tony. This is a record across the board.
Cool. Well, those are some really good questions. So great.
All right. Anything else you want to say?
No, I don't think so. There was one other, somebody submitted, and I don't know if they're still here or not. If you are, Marathon, thank you. But somebody asked a specific question about veterinary medical loan repayment program and whether or not consolidation would make them ineligible for the veterinary medical loan repayment program. And I know that question comes up quite frequently because the way the veterinary medical loan repayment program works is you can only, the payments towards your loans are only eligible towards your veterinary school loans. So I've heard it spun in ways that consolidation can make you ineligible for that program, and that's not true. You can still consolidate, but you have to have a way of showing how much of that balance is from veterinary school versus how much is not. And your student aid data file can help with that, as well as the My Student Loans tool and the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center. So as long as you can say, yeah, I've got $200,000 of student loans and 175 of it is from vet school, then that's, you know, that's what they need to know in order for you to get those payments made under the veterinary medical home.
Okay, and all of this webinar recording for the 60 of you that are still here, you rock stars. This will be sent out via email in the next couple days, along with the PDF checklist and all of these helpful links and information. Tony, anything else from you? Becca?
No,
Shiloh?
yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rebecca, Shiloh, Emily, Matt, Jordan, everybody that helped in answering questions behind the scenes, I'm assuming too. Wow, yeah, 195 I'm seeing there. Good job. That is amazing. So good luck to everybody. If you have any questions along the way, again, feel free to reach out, post in the student debt message board folder. You guys have the tools that you need right now to do this, right? Having that student aid data file, using the student debt center, running your simulations. I mean, questions are going to come up, but again, we're here to help you kind of wade through those questions as your veterinary career unfolds.
Yeah, and we will also, one of the links we'll send you is a link to the student debt folder. If you're not a member of VIN, we will send you all that information. All right, thanks everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in. Check the links and we look forward to seeing you for our next webinar. Take care.
Yep, thank you.